This book is the most remarkable piece of literature this world has ever seen. The Bible has outsold every other publication, been translated into more languages than any other. Some people were so committed to the concept of this being God's book that they were even willing to die for that proposition. At the hands of Nero, they were fed to the lions, or they were burned at the stake by Bloody Mary, Queen of England. Others used this same book as a justification for crusades that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. This is the story of how the Bible survived from the time of Moses until it reached the shores of America on the Mayflower.
God's first written communication with man was called the Decalogue. It means the 10 words. You and I know it better as the 10 Commandments. These were first given in an oral form, and then they were written down. Moses was asked to go up the mountain a second time, and God added to them the rights of people, the rights of property, and the rights of piety. This time, when Moses came down the mountain, Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. These became known as the Book of the Covenant. These, in fact, outside of a record of the Battle of Amalek, became the beginning of sacred writings, which today we call the Bible. It took 1,500 years to compile it. 40 different authors contributed, and they wrote in 3 different languages. Some of them used poetry, some history, and others biography. Many who wrote were kings or warriors, and others were priests or peasants. Some were devoted patriots and others were outlaws. What they produced has come to us in 2 testaments, comprised of 66 books. There is a word that needs to be a part of your vocabulary if it isn't. The word I'm referring to is the word canon. It refers to the collection of books which constitute the Bible. I'm interested in the Bible as that related to the Jews. They believed that the Bible was given by men with a special revelation that came from God, and that it was ultimately and finally the authority of all matters. It was the highest court of appeal to which man could go. The Bible that they have is not any different than the Bible that we have in terms of the Old Testament. They will tell you that the canonizing of the Scripture is not something that happened overnight. It's not decided at one council meeting. It's something that gradually takes place by God. When it did, they divided it into 3 parts. They had the law, or what they referred to as the Torah. They had the prophets, and then they had the writings, or what is referred to as the Hieroglyphia. It happens to be that if you look in Luke's Gospel chapter 24 and in verse 44, you will notice that is exactly the same division of the Bible that was given by Jesus. Writing was primitive, and there were no small letters or vowels or punctuation marks, and no spaces between words. and they wrote from the right-hand side of the page to the left. They only had 22 books in their Bible. It was, nevertheless, the exact same material that's in the 39 books of our Old Testament. But how did the accumulation of such writings occur? It is stated in Exodus 24:4, "And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. These were placed by the side of the Ark of the Covenant. Joshua then added to them, and Samuel still later. These, along with other references, show that the records of the Bible gradually grew and were, in the process, safely protected." Not only were the books of Moses written 1,500 years before Christ, but remember, according to tradition, the book of Job was written 400 years before that. In 586 BC, when the Babylonians came in and decided to desolate the land, they burned everything that was burnable in the temple, and then they pulled down all of the rocks or bricks that constituted it. They took the people for 70 years captivity. When they came back from the 70 years captivity, scattered over all the world, they built little synagogues, places where they could worship and educate. And that required a Bible for each one of these synagogues, and that brought a new institution, that of the scribes. They were fastidious. They regulated themselves as follows. They could only use clean animal skins, both to write on and even to bind the manuscripts. They could have no less than 48 and no more than 60 lines on a page. The ink must be black, of a special recipe. They must verbalize aloud each word while they're writing it. They must wipe the pen and wash their entire bodies before writing the word Jehovah, and every time they write it. There must be a revision within 30 days, and if 3 pages required correction, the entire document must be replaced. The letter, words, and paragraphs must be counted, and the document becomes invalid if 2 letters even touch each other. All documents could only be stored in sacred places, and all old and worn documents were buried with ceremonial pomp. Before the invention of the printing press, this painstaking process helped contribute to the Scriptures' remarkable accuracy when compared to recent archaeological discoveries. When Alexander the Great conquered the world, it was an age of philosophical reasoning. Men were asking questions. There were stars in the field of questions like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, but they didn't have answers to their questions. They only had the questions, but they left the mind of man with a vacuum, with a vacancy, something that had to be filled in, and they were waiting for somebody who could come and give them the answer to the questions. By the time that Alexander died in 323 BC, the world had become bilingual, and Greek was the second language everyone used. For this reason, it became important to have a Greek translation of the Bible. At this time, around 285 BC, there were many Jews who were part of the Egyptian subculture. According to tradition, Demetrius of Phalerum, head of the world-famous library in Alexandria, asked King Ptolemy Philadelphus of Egypt if he could arrange to have a Greek translation of the Jewish law made for the library. To accomplish that, the king released 100,000 Jewish slaves that he had in his realm, and he sent them, along with a very generous gift and an ambassador, to Eleazar, the high priest of Jerusalem. And he made this request. He wanted him to collect 6 scholars from each of the 12 tribes, constituting 72 men. These 72 men were to go to Alexandria to do the translating work. When they went to Alexandria, they were given a royal welcome at the courts. They were then sent to the island of Pharos, And on that island, specially prepared, there were 72 cubicles, one for each of the men, and in 72 days they translated the entire Torah. They were so encouraged by what they did, each man agreed with the other man's translation. They called the work that they accomplished the Septuagint. That is the Greek word for 70. Ever since the Babylonian captivity, the Jews have been living under some form of oppression. The Old Testament is permeated with prophecies that foretell of a Savior who would liberate the Jews and crush their enemies. Both Jewish and Christian scholars will agree that a central theme of the Bible points to a Messiah, a Christ. The conclusion, therefore, is that the Old Testament is Christocentric. It comes to us like an old weather-beaten chart that's out of focus. The men, for example, that walk across its pages, like Adam, like Abraham, like Moses, like David. The structures that they built, like a tabernacle, having 2 separate veils and 7 pieces of furniture. The wall of that last tabernacle being behind me at the moment. When the blurred became clear, it focused on the person of a Jewish Messiah. New Testament writers claimed that Jesus Christ was that Messiah. They were willing to admit that he did commit miracles, but because he was a carpenter's son, they weren't willing to admit that it was powered by God. They believed rather that it was energized by Satan. There's no question it's what the apostles believed. They said to him, gave all the prophets witness that through his name whosoever believeth in him. And the biggest problem of all that he had was that he claimed the title of a king, and that made the Roman Empire a little bit nervous. The theme of the New Testament puts a spotlight on this Christ, whom they believed to be Jesus of Nazareth. The Jewish religious leaders strongly denounced their conclusion. In their minds, they saw him as a fraud who could never be the Savior that was foretold by the prophets. To the writers of the New Testament, Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah. They contended that only in retrospect could you see all the scriptures that foretold of this man. And it was the message of this man that would later embody almost the entire text of the New Testament. I invited you here to this little sleepy town of Bethlehem that goes all the way back into the book of Genesis because it has 1,000 memories. Some of them are tragic and some of them are triumphant. On these hills behind me, it's the place where David tended his sheep, and it's the place where Samuel the prophet came and anointed him so that he became a king over Israel. But the most stupendous event of human history, according to Christians, happened in this little town. I know when I say the name Jesus Christ that you have heard about him. Maybe you forget. He is an actual person that lived in history. The people that lived contemporary with him identify him. And there's no question they speak about the enormous influence that he had and the purported miracles that he performed. He made some fantastic claims about himself. He claimed to be the Son of God. He said that he was sent by the Father to lead humanity into salvation. He also claimed that he was the way, the truth, and the light, and that no man could come unto God except it was through him. Confucius, Buddha, and even Muhammad never made such bold claims. But his greatest prediction related to his sacrificial death, to be followed by a resurrection from the dead 3 days later. To the Jewish religious leaders of his day, his claims were preposterous, in fact blasphemous. So they handed him over to Roman authorities, and the Roman authorities took him to a place called the Place of a Skull. which many historians to believe at this location. And there, against a gibbet of wood, they crucified him. But this rock isn't the end of his story. Near the place of the skull where they crucified him, there was a garden, and in that garden was a new rock-hewn tomb. And in that tomb, they laid his lifeless body. It is believed by many historians that this could be the location where that happened. They took a large stone and rolled it against the door. They sealed it, and then they posted a guard of Roman soldiers around it. It was early the next Sunday morning that the women came to embalm the body. When they got here, they found out that the body had already been embalmed. The embalmment was still in its place, but the body was missing. Now, the disciples said that it's because he was resurrected from the dead. But the authorities tried to give every other conceivable explanation to explain why the body was missing. They said, for example, that the disciples came and stole it. But they never explained how they could have stolen it, and they never issued a warrant to arrest them. The soldiers said, we fell asleep when we were on duty. But nobody ever reprimanded them for being asleep on duty. And what court in the land would accept as a creditable witness the people who were asleep when the crime was committed? To the authorities, his death was the closing of an unpleasant chapter in the calendar of an upstart religious sect. To writers of the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus was an absolute confirmation that he was the true Messiah. The Apostle Paul wrote that if Christ be not raised from the dead, our faith is futile. Whether it was fact or fiction, it literally transformed the disciples from men who were afraid, hiding behind locked doors, to leaders who were willing to be persecuted and even die for their faith in this man. If we were to take the first century and divide it according to truth, it would fall into a threefold division. First, it was living truth. At that time, the master of the disciples was alive, and as long as he lived, his words were important. It is stated according to Dr. Luke, who wrote his gospel, that he was mighty in word and in deed, meaning that his words were oracles and his deeds were miracles. When you come into the second period, from 30 to 50, it's a period of oral tradition. They didn't bother writing anything because they believed that he was going to come quickly and writing was unnecessary. But when you go into the third division, from 50 to 90, that's the period of written communication. It was at that time that certain conditions came about that required the writing of letters, and it was those letters which became the basis of our New Testament. Christianity was growing at such an explosive rate that the apostles couldn't keep up with its rapid expansion. The writing of letters became an indispensable tool to communicate to the fledgling church. In some cases, they wrote to reprove, in other cases to encourage. These same letters would become part of the Bible. Peter wrote to the Hebrew Christians who were scattered throughout Asia Minor because of severe persecution, and for which they needed the strongest encouragement. Though he faded from the picture by Acts chapter 12, he was faithful to the end of his days. John, being the youngest of the apostles, outlived them all. He wrote 3 letters or epistles, which inspired holy living, and a gospel, which highlighted some of the things that were omitted by the other 3 writers. His most outstanding work was written while he was in exile on the Isle of Patmos. He lifted the veil and allowed us to look into the future in his book that became known as the Revelation. But the most notable and prolific writer of the New Testament was the most zealous persecutor of the church in his early days, Saul of Tarsus. It had been 7 years since Jesus Christ had ascended, and a problem brewed between Hebrew and Grecian widows, and in order to solve it, they selected 7 men whom they called deacons. All of the 7 had Greek names. 2 of them came into the limelight. One was Philip, one was Stephen. Stephen was the first one to get the focus of attention. He had gone before the Sanhedrin, accused them of murdering the Messiah, and based on a verse in Isaiah, contended that God did not dwell in one single place. What he said enraged both Sadducees and Pharisees. The reason the Sadducees didn't like what Stephen said is because they didn't believe in angels or a life after death, and they only accepted the inspiration of the Pentateuch. The reason the Pharisees didn't like it, who believed in the inspiration of Isaiah, they didn't like his interpretation. So they took Stephen and they brought him to this location at what's known as Stephen's Gate, and they stoned him. He was the first martyr, and since his day, arenas' floors have been soaked red with human blood. When that enraged mob started to stone Stephen, they had to take off their coats to do the job. There was a middle-aged man, inactive in what they were doing, and they put their garments at his feet. He saw things, he heard things, and he felt things that he never forgot the rest of his life. They referred to him as Saul, but he later became known to us as Paul the Apostle. Paul's home was in Tarsus of Cilicia, a Greek province, and its environment of philosophers, grammarians, and poets must have contributed to his mental skills. His family were of the strictest Jews. Both he and his father were Pharisees. He was fluent in the Hebrew language. He selected the Rabbinical College at Jerusalem for his training, and he sat at the feet of the highly esteemed Gamaliel. When he later stood before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, he informed them that he was a Roman, meaning that he held Roman citizenship. Their reactions to that information testified to its value. That citizenship exempted him from slavery, excused him from degrading punishments like scourging and crucifixion. It gave him the right to appeal any lower court decision to the emperor. And most important of all, it provided him with the freedom to roam the world. He became possessed of an uncontrolled passion to persecute Christians, as he had watched them do with Stephen. His thirst was insatiable. He enlarged the realm of his persecution, taking him on a mission to Damascus. And on that journey, through a vision, he was dramatically converted to Christ. His passion, however, never subsided, merely redirected. When the city of Damascus heard about his conversion and his presence in the city, they determined they were going to take his life. They posted a guard at every single gate. But from the wall, through a window, in a basket, his friends let him down and he escaped. He went to Arabia for 3 years. He went to visit the apostles in the city of Jerusalem. Then the church at Antioch called him for service, and then later they ordained him to the Christian ministry. He became a legend in his own day. He started pioneering Gentile churches on 2 separate continents, in 3, if not 4, separate missionary journeys. His work was tireless for 30 years. He traveled over 12,000 miles on land and sea in a day without the convenience of modern transportation. Most of the miles were covered on foot. When he stopped, he became the center of riots, and at one of these they stoned him and left him believing he was dead. Because of the tremendous scope of Paul's pioneering ministry, it necessitated the follow-up of letters to many of the churches he founded.
In this area, Paul became the most prolific writer of all the New Testament authors. He was the writer of over half the New Testament epistles, and many of these letters were written while he was in chains. His final letter was written during his imprisonment, waiting the decision of Caesar. I've taken a little intermission to bring you here to the city of Rome, particularly to the Mamertine prison where Paul was kept. It's about 20 feet below the ground, and about 50 yards away is the Roman Senate. Beyond that, the Roman Forum, and beyond that, the Palace of the Caesars, and then the dreaded Colosseum. The chariots went about across the roof where he was, on cobblestones, and all the business of an imperial Roman power was transacted right above him. Let's go down to the place where he was kept a prisoner. This is the actual cell from which Paul wrote that last letter that he ever wrote. He was in this location when he did it. When he wrote to the Romans, he earlier said that he hoped to have a prosperous journey by the will of God to come unto them. But when he came, he described himself as Paul the Aged. He had chains on his arms and soldiers around his body. He was cold. He talked about a cloak they had left at Troas. He was friendless. He said, Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present evil world. He said, at my first answer no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. And he had the sense that it was all over. He said, I am now ready to be offered. If there was some way that it was possible for us to take the pulse of Paul so that we could tell what his heartbeat was and ask him a question, like, how are you doing, Paul? He would say, I am an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, of Jesus Christ, unafraid of the imperial power above him, by the will of God, not changed by the circumstance that appears to be adverse. We said, what about dying, Paul? How do you feel about that? He would have said, the time of my departure is at hand. I fought a good fight. I finished the course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. In other words, when you measure the power of the pen, there's no way that you can question the fact it's sharper than any sword. The Apostle Paul was but one of a long list of writers of the New Testament who were martyred. According to tradition, Peter was supposedly imprisoned with Paul, and Peter died at the hand of the Emperor Nero. He was brought out, whipped, and crucified with his head down. According to John Fox, the historian, Peter chose to be crucified upside down because he didn't think he was worthy to suffer in the same way as Jesus. St. Thomas, according to tradition, traveled to India, where he was boiled to death for his faith. The only apostle to escape martyrdom was John. It is believed that he even survived being boiled in oil. However, he lived to be a very old man. All the other New Testament writers were crucified, killed by the sword, beaten with clubs, beheaded, or burned to death. The earliest fragment of the New Testament dates back between 120 and 150 AD. It is known as the Rylands manuscript and is kept at the University of Manchester in England. Believing that John's Gospel was written as one of the last books of our New Testament, the original document was written at the earliest but 25 years previously. There are no first edition copies of the Bible available. That should not alarm us after we learn about the fastidious concern over old documents and the meticulous supervision in preserving them. The Bible was given to us in fragments, and paleographers have had to piece together several separate documents in order to get one complete copy. The latest discoveries of these manuscripts have testified to the meticulous process of copying the scriptures, and if anything, dispelled the perception that the Bible is not an accurate translation from the original authors.
The most recent of these discoveries was made in 1947 in the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most important segment of that referred to as the Qumran. There were 11 caves here where they collectively found these documents, and in doing so it's believed that they were at least part of the library of a sect of the Essenes that had a little community built not far from where we are at the moment. There's a great deal of value that came to us from these discoveries. In the first place, we were able collectively to reproduce the entire Old Testament with the exception of the book of Esther. In the second place, we built a bridge that brought us closer to the original documents by 1,000 years over anything that we had previously. And in the third place, and probably most significantly, we discovered that we really didn't have to make any changes in what we had originally translated into the Word of God. There are two major contributions that were made by Rome to Christianity, though maybe without intention. The first was in the field of administrative law. It dated back to 451 BC when they had what they called the 12 tablets. But the empire grew to become 120 million people, and with it they developed a legal process. In doing so, it was so well done that it became the basis of law in Europe, and especially in England. And because of England, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, wherever English-speaking people were. And it was a contribution to Christianity inasmuch as wherever their citizens went in the world, they fell under their protection. The second major contribution was in building. I say building because their major concern was the mobilization of an army. They wanted to be sure that an army could travel as fast as it was possible, and therefore they built roads and bridges and walls. You can see beside me an aqueduct that was built in the 2nd century that brought fresh water into the city of Caesarea, and look at how remarkably well preserved it is today. These two factors and others greatly aided in the spread of Christianity.
The catacombs under the city of Rome were used for a Christian burial ground. There are an estimated 4 million graves here. In Rome, there were 40 separate Christian congregations meeting just before the last persecution. By this time, Christians could be found in the Roman Empire as far away as England. Not only were they growing numerically, they were penetrating vertically through every social stratum. We know that the common people and the wealthy heard him gladly. Christianity could never have survived without the Bible. It was this the early church had in common. It became the very foundation on which they lived and died. I'm sure that every parent remembers watching a baby crawl for the first time. And I'm equally sure that you would love to have had a camera so you could have captured those first steps on film. You remember the wobbly legs, the uncertain steps, and it told you that that little baby had muscles in its body that must be developed. It's in much the same way that the Christian church entered into the pages of history. It was controversy that caused it, but it taught that early church that there were muscles in its body, and those muscles were going to have to be developed. These controversies and heresies all attempted to, willfully or otherwise, destroy the unity of the church, the purity of their doctrine, and the authority of their Bible. In fact, these attacks served three beneficial purposes. First, they proved that heresies can be healthy in their effect on the body. Germs give rise to antibodies. Second, false theologies were the instruments to give birth to true Christian theology. Finally, and most important to our story, conflict forced the development of an authoritative and universally recognized Bible. One of the most notable men who defended the church against these heresies was Polycarp. He was a disciple of the Apostle John and was appointed by him to be the pastor of the church in Smyrna. He was knowledgeable of nearly all the New Testament letters. After several from his church faced the lions courageously, the persecutors cried for their pastor, Polycarp. It was one of his servants under torture that told them where the master was staying. They went and arrested him and they brought him to the city. The chief magistrate of the city took him into his chariot and asked him to call the emperor Lord and offer a sacrifice to him. When he declined to do it, they threw him out of the chariot, and when he hit the ground, he broke his ankle on the pavement. They picked him up and brought him to the arena. The judge in the arena offered him the opportunity to curse Christ, and he would be able to go free. And he gave his famous response to that. 86 years have I served him, and he never did me any harm. How can I blaspheme my King and my Savior? Realizing that he simply wasn't afraid of the lions, somebody in the stand shouted, "Let him burn." And it echoed all the way around the arena until everybody was shouting, "Burn him, burn him, burn him." When they ignited the fire, the executioner wasn't satisfied it was burning quickly enough, and so he threw a dagger into his body. When the ordeal was over, his friends came and stirred among the embers, found the charred bones, and took them and gave them a decent burial. Behind me you see the ruins of the old Roman Colosseum. Began to be built by Vespasian in 72 AD and was completed by his son Titus in 80 AD. But then the Normans came in 1084 and they left it the way we see it today. Why is it left this much standing? Probably because it's a monument to Christian martyrs. There's no question it's the symbol of the power of imperial Rome. On the other hand, it's one of the dark pages in human history in which the church had to face bitter persecution. The story of the martyrs is told in 10 chapters, 10 separate waves of persecution rolled against the church. It had these earmarks. It was usually on a local level until the year 250 when it became an empire issue. Second, it was usually, though not always, centered in an emperor. The relief or subsidence came at the emperor's death. Though a Jewish persecution had preceded it, the Roman hostility began in 64, occasioned by Nero. The Roman historian Tacitus reported Rome being set on fire. Nero declared it the work of Christians and put great numbers of them to death after frightful tortures. Other historians tell of the troublesome coat the Christians were made to wear. It was made of coarse cloth, covered with pitch, wax, and sulfur. Being dressed in this coat, they were hung by their chins with sharp stakes fixed in the ground and set on fire. Nero had them burned at midnight for torches to the city. Stories are told of houses filled with Christians and then burned to the ground. Companies of 50 tied with ropes then hurried into the seas. Swords, red-hot chairs, wheels for stretching human bodies, and talons of iron to tear them. All the attempt of Rome to stamp out the influence of these Christians. There are 4 basic reasons why the citizens of the Roman Empire persecuted the Christians. One was political. These Christians met at nighttime in clandestine places and were suspicious of being another political party. Second was religious. They refused to burn incense on an altar to Caesar, acknowledging that Caesar was God. Third is social. They had a philosophy of human life that was different. They believed that all men were equal. It was the philosophy of Rome that Nero was at one end of the continuum and slaves were on the opposite end of the continuum. And finally, financial reasons, because people made a living making, for example, in Ephesus, little black idols unto Diana, and the gospel put them out of business. The 10th and final wave came in March 303. It was an edict issued by the Emperor Diocletian. It called for an end to all meetings, the destruction of all church buildings, the disposition of all officers, the imprisonment of those who persisted in disobedience, and the submission of all sacred writings to be confiscated and burned. Eusebius, the historian, confirmed that a later edict ordered the Christians to sacrifice to the pagan gods or be put to death. He also reported that prisons became so crowded that there was no room to accommodate the criminals. The persecution slackened when Diocletian abdicated and retired in 305. Galerius issued an edict from his deathbed in 311, giving toleration to Christianity. When we ask the question, what value came out of this 241 years of persecution? We admit it's a difficult question to answer. But have you recognized that under every wave of persecution, the number of believers grew? Do you realize that they focused on the definition of what a church was? They even questioned the right of those who compromised under persecution, whether or not they had a right to continue in fellowship with believers. And then there's the question about the authority of the Bible. When you stop and think about it, it wasn't as yet canonized, but there were certain letters that held supreme authority, and they redirected the priorities of people. Now, there is an interest in this indestructible book. I am at the moment on one of the 7 hills of Rome, and probably it's the most important of the 7 hills. That because this was the center of their religious life, and here's where the Caesars built their palaces. But the whole structure was changed by Michelangelo when the Renaissance occurred. And here you can see, thanks to him, a statue to Constantine. In spite of the fact that Constantine put an end to the persecutions directed toward the church, his priorities were misdirected. He considered affluence the sign of divine approval. He brought bishops who had been reduced to relative poverty, scarred and dazed by recent persecutions, and he brought them into palaces that blazed with light and breathed of perfume. He built churches, staffed them with a body of clergymen and bishops, when there was no known profession of Christianity in that region. He bestowed large sums of wealth in it for the support of the poor, assuming that that would produce conversions. However, when I've said all of these negatives about Constantine, there's one thing positive that I must mention. It was he that asked Athanasius if he would prepare 50 Bibles and have them copied so that he could take them to the new empire head in the east, Constantinople. That did one thing. That got people asking the question, what is the Bible? And that prepared the ground for canonizing of Scripture. Inasmuch as the early church was expecting that their Savior would return quickly, and inasmuch as he had commissioned them to go out and to preach the gospel to every creature, they really never became interested in writing. They didn't have the time for writing. Then there came a time when I understand writing began, but only to try and capture the sense of the message. They weren't concerned about what words were used or what tenses or syntax. They simply wanted to convey enough information so that converts could be won over to Christianity. But then came that dreaded time in 303 under the Diocletian persecution. They did something then that they had never done before in persecution. They called for the destruction of all sacred documents. We don't know what we lost at that time. We believe that there were literally thousands upon thousands of documents that were taken from us because of that persecution. And as soon as that period passed, then came the reverse, an avid desire to know what was written. At this time, scribes became very busy, and in the busyness of those scribes, in what was purported to be copies of the sacred writings, there were literally 13,000 of those copies circulating in Christendom. It was at this time that the greatest theologian of his time, Athanasius, began to crusade for an authoritative canonized New Testament. When we talk about a canon, we're simply talking about a measuring rod, a plumb line, or acceptable weights used to balance scales. The word was first applied to the scriptures by Athanasius in the 4th century. The story of the canonization of the New Testament is not a recording of a simple act. It was a slow process which went through several stages. But in 367 AD, Athanasius wrote a letter in which he listed for the first time in recorded history the 27 books of the New Testament. In 397, the Council of Carthage gave the first official approval of the 27 New Testament books. The Church, in a generic sense, now possessed a voice of authority. To this authority, every council, conclave, priest, or pope, every deliberative body submitted. The Word became supreme.
I'm standing in a stone grotto in the city of Bethlehem that's only about 20 by 20, where a man spent 16 years of his life, and he did the greatest thing that he could have done for mankind. His name was Jerome. He was born in Dalmatia in 347 to Christian parents. His father took care of his early education, then sent him to the city of Rome to study rhetoric and philosophy from a great teacher named Donatus. While he was there, he submitted to Christian baptism. That had a profound effect upon his life. He left there in 390, and at that time he was translating a commentary on the book of Psalms. He and 3 friends decided they would travel to the east. They got as far as the town of Antioch when he took seriously sick. A high fever got a hold of his body, and one night in the delirium, he dreamed a dream that Christ came to him and told him he was not a Christian. For that, he dedicated his life to what he considered to be the most difficult task possible, and that was learning and mastering the Hebrew language. The following year, he was in the city of Constantinople, and powerful preaching against Arianism moved him to become a defender of the faith. But then 2 years later, he went to the city of Rome to try and mediate in a council that was being held. In the process, he met Damascus, who was the bishop of Rome. He was later to become the pope, and a strong bond came between these two men, and close friendship developed. So close that Damascus asked Jerome, would he be kind enough to translate directly from the Hebrew Old Testament into the Latin language for the first time.
Latin became more important in the affairs of the empire. In North Africa, it was being used exclusively for communicating religious information, and so it became an imperative to have an accurate translation from the original languages into Latin. And there was no one more qualified to do this than Jerome. Jerome moved here to Bethlehem to live a monastic life and dedicated himself to this enormous task. In the year 405, his mission was complete, but he spent the rest of his life in Bethlehem, dedicating himself to writing defenses for the Orthodox faith. He finally died in 420. Though his work became known as the Vulgate, or Bible in the common language, it also became the very instrument which blocked the road to any other Vulgate. It was so highly esteemed that succeeding generations decided to forbid any other translation. Instead, Latin would become the official language of the Church. All other languages were thereby deprived of any translation in their mother tongue, and the good became the enemy of the best. This, in fact, deprived the public of a Bible and sent the world plunging into the darkness of the Middle Ages.
I'm standing here in front of a Trappist monastery situated between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and I'm here to introduce you to the subject of monasticism. Jerome had to come to Rome to mediate at a council in 382, and when he arrived there, he saw the secular influence on the church, the opulence of the church, the struggle for authority, and the absence of piety greatly disturbed him. So he became a preacher on monasticism. When he left Rome and went to Bethlehem to finish the translating work of the Bible, some of his converts followed him. One was a very wealthy widow by the name of Paula. She and her son went to Bethlehem, and they founded 4 monasteries there, 3 of them for nuns and 1 of them for a monk. According to Philip Schaff, the great church historian, he said that Jerome is the father of Roman monasticism. And there's no question that after Jerome's day, it flourished all the way from Asia Minor to Britain. It's appropriate that I'm standing here by the tomb of St. Jerome, inasmuch as he's considered the father of Roman monasticism. If you were able to go to a monastery and peep through the window, I think what you would see would persuade you that they were the salt of their generation. The Benedictine order, for example, were very highly organized. Every individual had a specific task, both sacred and secular, and that's what helped to keep them separate from the feudal system of their day. There was prayer and praise day and night. There were vigils and vespers, but there was something more important than that. These places were really educational centers. The people that lived there spent their time writing or copying philosophy and literature. But they did something more important than that. They copied the scriptures, and they kept the Bible alive in a generation when it might have died. That's the reason for which we think of them as being white lilies in muddy ponds.
It is axiomatic that the first steps in the downfall are the saddest steps of all. And when did those steps take place for the downfall of the Roman Empire? Some will say that it was when they divided the empire between East and West. But perhaps it's more accurately the 20-year war they had against the Goths that ended in 555. And only 13 years later, another Germanic tribe by the name of Lombards came, and they invaded this city. And what the Goths hadn't ruined, they certainly did ruin. But then a man came to the papacy by the name of Gregory. They called him Gregory the Great, and he deserved the title. He was a magnificent man. Because the Lombard army had been unpaid, he then decided that he would take the monies that belonged to the church and pay off that army. And by doing so, he became known as the savior of Caesar's empire. And it was that brought universality and unity to the church. The church was the supreme power during this age, but this power is a sad chapter in the history of Christianity. The Bible was relegated to the closed doors of the monastery. It had been placed on a pedestal and confined to a language that only the privileged few could read. In the meantime, The church was consumed with its political objectives, and that ushered in crusades and other atrocities. Countless lives would be wasted, but now the church was primarily responsible. However, in the far-off Isles of Britain, the Bible was just starting to cause shock waves that would change the course of history forever. I'm in one of the famous taxi cabs of London, on my way from the airport to the hotel, on what I might refer to as being a typical day in London. Our travels took us to Israel, and then we went to Rome, and now we've arrived in Great Britain. We looked at the things that made available to us a Bible in the first place. Then we looked at some of the people who had to suffer persecution because of their adherence to it. And now I want to introduce you to the man who gave us the first Bible that we ever had in English. Thank you. Thank you. We're also going to tell you about the match that lit the fires of the Reformation. Stay tuned. In telling the story of the spread of Christianity, I have to pause for a moment by way of intermission and tell you about how it reached the fringes of the empire. That's why I'm standing here next to an old Roman wall that dates back to 55 BC. When they came to Britain, of course, they came by armies. Those armies eventually brought over Christianity. I find a place here in England that's been excavated where a Roman general lived, and he had a symbolism of Christianity on the walls of his house. There is a Hinton head of Christ that dates back to the 4th century that's in the British Museum. It's a mosaic that's made out of tile, and it dates to a period of time that proves that Christianity was in this island by the 300s. To tell a story of how it grew in this island, I have to introduce you to two very important men, and that's my privilege. Though much of our knowledge is conjecture, St. Patrick appears to have been born in Scotland in the year 389. His father was reputed to be wealthy, a deacon, and undoubtedly Patrick was disciplined as a Christian. When he was 16 years of age, a band of marauders plundered his neighborhood, and he was taken captive to Ireland. He spent the next 6 years there, serving as the chieftain's shepherd. His religious visions kept him alive. Patrick was able to escape, and he found a group of sea traders that were taking Irish wolf dogs over to the continent. He arranged with them to let him join them, and 3 days later they landed in France. He stayed in their company for the next 2 months, and then eventually settled somewhere in the Mediterranean area. But the call from home was so strong he came back to his native land.
According to the legend, one day he was visited by a man by the name of Victorius in a dream. He was carrying a group of parchments. One of these parchments was named Ireland. Victorius took the parchment, handed it to St. Patrick, and said, "Come and walk among us again." And on the basis of that, St. Patrick committed himself to come back to the land that had been his prison and try and reach these people for Christ. It was against the wishes of his friends that he did it. It took him 14 years to prepare for it, but eventually he came back. And according to the legend, it was at the ruins of Dunseverick Castle, where he made his headquarters, and from here he reached out until he touched all of Northern Ireland and eventually influenced all of these people for Christianity. It was 461 when he retired, but at that time he was the Bishop of Armagh. According to legend, this grey stone behind me is the final resting place of St. Patrick. But before I close the chapter of his life, I'd like to add two addendums to what I've already said. Number one is, it was this man that brought Christianity to Ireland. Historians greatly disagree on a number of facts about his life, but none of them disagree on this fact. Ireland is indebted to this man for Christianity coming to the island. The second postscript that I want to make relates to the fact that apparently during St. Patrick's absence from Scotland, Scotland reverted back to paganism. But through the influence of St. Patrick in Ireland, 102 years later, among the thousands of people that had been brought to Christ, was another man who in a frail bark and 12 companions left this island and went over to Scotland to evangelize Scotland. And that man's name was St. Columba. Columba was born in December 521 AD in the northern part of Ireland known as Ulster. He was a descendant of a royal family, and according to many accounts, he could have been chosen the High King of Ireland. It was Finian, the leading scholar abbot of the day, who introduced Columba to a meaningful commitment to Christ and a systematic study of the Scripture. Columba was eventually ordained to the priesthood. He, along with several other young monks, began establishing monasteries. During this period, legend ascribes over 100 monasteries were planted by Columba. He decided to leave his native Ireland and become a missionary to Scotland. Selecting 12 companions in an imitation of the early disciples, Columba set out for the pagan lands of the northeast. They finally landed on a small island of Iona, about half a mile off the Scottish mainland. Columba moved quickly to build his monastery, which would serve as their missionary base camp. During this time, Iona became the very center of evangelization for Scotland and North England. He was even bold enough to share the gospel with the barbarian king of the Picts, which resulted in his conversion, which translated into relative peace between the Picts and the Scots. Columba, because of his love for the Bible, is crucial to the story of the Indestructible Book. He wrote poetry and dearly loved the poetic books of the Bible, especially the Psalms. Columba's example of self-denial and pious living was enforced by an abundance of reported miraculous manifestations of power, prophecy, and healing. It was his devotion to the Bible that made him the greatest missionary Scotland and England have ever known. At the age of 75, after a day spent transcribing a psalm, he arose from his hard bed to join his brethren at their traditional midnight service. Arriving ahead of them, and weakened from years of labor, he knelt before the altar and he collapsed. Columba revived briefly,
gave his monks a farewell blessing, and died peacefully in the early hours of Sunday on June the 9th in 597. It's more than a coincidence that we should end the story of St. Columba by coming back to the grave of St. Patrick. I say more than a coincidence because it was Scotland that evangelized Ireland through St. Patrick. It was Ireland that evangelized Scotland through St. Columba. These two were associated with each other, much like father and son, like cause and effect. Their ministries were exactly the same. The effects of their ministries were exactly the same. And by coincidence, both bodies are buried in the same tomb. According to tradition, this is the gravestone of both St. Patrick and St. Columba. We pause at this point in our story to pay our respects to a handful of men in this Old English or Anglo-Saxon period. These men tried with primitive means to translate the scriptures into their native tongues. One of them was just a stableman. The area is the coastal town of Whitby in Northumbria, North England. This specific location is an abbey, the only remains of a monastery that goes back to the year 664. It was then that a great convention was held here, and they debated whether they would maintain the British date for Easter or whether they would change to the Roman date. It's very possible at that convention a man by the name of Caedmon was present, because it was 16 years later in 680 that he died. Caedmon was a stable boy. He looked after the horses and the cattle, and at the end of a busy day, all of the different people of the monastery would meet together at the great hall. They would get around a great fire and have a feast, and then they would entertain each other with a harp, and they would sing to one another. Every time it was Caedmon's turn to sing, he would quietly excuse himself. Something was important in the stables and he had to go and take care of the horses and the cattle. On this occasion, when he went back to the stables, he was met, according to the story, by a heavenly visitor. The angel said to Caedmon, "Sing for me." He said, "I can't sing, and that's why I left the feast." The visitor insisted, "Sing for me, Caedmon." He said, "What should I sing?" He said, "Sing about the beginning of created things." Caedmon sang, and he not only surprised himself with his talent in singing, but even with the knowledge that he had about created things. The next day, the heavenly visitor had left, but the gift remained. Hilda was the abbess of the monastery, and she determined it was enough to influence him to leave his secular life and join the monastery. Of course, if he was going to minister to people, it meant that he had to listen to a priest read the Bible in Latin and then explain to him in English what it meant. And in that, he would convert into poetry. That, incidentally, although primitive, is the first kind of translation of the English Bible that we ever had. And he would minister his gift, spellbinding people in the process, and through it, communicating the Word of God. Christ is the morning star, who, when the night of this world is past, brings to his saints the promise of the light of life and opens everlasting day. That is a modern translation of Revelation 2, verse 28. You notice above it, it was written in Latin. That is as close as we can come today to the translation that was given to us by the Venerable Bede. The Venerable Bede is the fourth person about whom I want to speak, and the remains of that man are under this slab. This grave is housed in one of the wings of the great Durham Cathedral. The Durham Cathedral is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, cathedral in England. But how the body got to be here is a story of its own. It happened that the Venerable Bede died in 735. It wasn't until the year 1022 that somebody from this location went to the place of his burial and took the remains and brought them here. And they have been here ever since. But the place where he died and the place where he did his ministry is at Jarrow on the Tyne. The Venerable Bede was a monk, a scholar, a mathematician, a historian, and a theologian. It was he that wrote the Ecclesiastical History of England, and for that he gained the title of the Father of English History. But his last and his greatest work was in translating John's Gospel. He was very frail and weak at the time, and he would translate and then dictate for a scribe what to write. On one occasion, the scribe came in and informed his master that they were at the last chapter, but he was afraid that the master was too frail to be able to finish it. "No," said Bede, "write quickly." It happened that they came down at the end of that day to the last verse, and when he just finished translating the last verse, he leaned back onto his pillow, and he died, somewhere close to where I'm standing at this moment, because he used to worship in this very hall. While I travel in a train through the spectacular scenery of the Alps, I'm reminded of a group of people that lived here during the Middle Ages. They were called the Albigenses. They got their name from a town from which they came, which was Albi. They did have what some would consider strange viewpoints. They believed that when Satan sinned, God gave him a body and cast him out of heaven, and that he made all things that are material. Therefore, matter is intrinsically evil. And the only way that you could liberate the spirit from its prison of flesh is to keep ascetically all the restrictions that they required in various different areas of life. They believed that unless you took a certain sacrament just before you died, then you were going to have to be reincarnated again. Now, you may not agree with that, but a friend of mine once said something I've never forgotten. He said, "The price of freedom is the defense of idiots." I'm not saying they're idiots. I am saying that in freedom we have to put up with people that do not agree with us, but they did not believe that in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, they severely persecuted whoever disagreed with them. The Albigenses paid a high price for their strange beliefs. They were persecuted and killed. In France in the year 1210, in just one day, 200 were burned to death. Another group that were mercilessly persecuted and killed were the Waldensians. The chief tenet of their faith was that the Bible was the supreme authority. Their heartbeat was evangelism. They believed that the leader should abandon secular living, live by begging, and preach the word. In 1147, the Pope had sent missionaries to convert these heathen, who, when they failed, were to apply fire and sword. One of the tortures was to force them to hold onto a red-hot bar of iron. Pope Innocent III's campaign captured the camp of Minerva, where they found 180 persons who preferred being burned alive to adopting the Roman Church creed. In 1215, 450 of them, persistent in their obstinacy, continued to resist, of whom 400 were burned, and the rest were hanged. Persecution actually had the same effect that it had in ancient Rome. It multiplied the number of people and strengthened their resolve. It was then they came up into the Piedmont Valley in the Alps, and they did so to find a refuge. But then the world was shocked in May of 1655. Emmanuel II had taken his armies in to enforce an edict. The edict was that either you recant your faith or you vacate the place. And the world was stunned by it, because they had sent the women and children and the old men up into higher regions so that they could be safe, while boys and men stayed behind to agitate the enemy. But the enemy found that little hiding place where the old men and the women and children were staying, and they shoved them over the top, and they even took women with children in their arms and threw them over the top of those craggy mountains. And it was John Milton that said, "Their bodies lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold." And he agitated Oliver Cromwell to write a letter publicly. And Oliver Cromwell did it, and it brought temporary relief for them. Chapter 2 ends with the darkness of the Middle Ages, waiting for the morning star of an inevitable reformation. I'm on a boat at the moment on the River Thames in modern London. Behind me you can see the famous Tower of London, and in a moment the Tower Bridge. But this is not the London of 1324 when John Wycliffe was born. John Wycliffe, like any other prophet, is a man who comes as a root out of a dry ground. To give you an idea of how dry the ground was in the day in which he lived, let me tell you that he was born in 1324, about 6 miles away from Richmond in Yorkshire. He had an amazing mind. It was said that he was able to deliberate with men in council and argue until they didn't have a single question to ask or a response to give. Let me tell you about the courage of this man Wycliffe, because he stood against the power of the king, the power of the parliament, the power of the university, and even, the worst of all, the power of the imperial church. Let me tell you about the charisma of this man. He was able to gather around him a group of men who were willing to go out for his convictions and die by being burned to death. If there is one word that summarizes the day in which he lived, it's the word flux. Everything was in a state of change. In looking at the major changes of his day, I think the first thing that we have to look at would be languages.
Anybody want free storms for power? No! Too there for a pound in a bloody chain!
The first important area is in that of language. The people that lived in that day spoke Middle English. Now technically that's the same language that we speak today, but if we had been listening to them in that day, we wouldn't have understood them. And conversely, if they were with me here on the streets of London listening to me, they wouldn't be able to understand what we were talking about. You see, English is a conglomerate of languages, and it has gone through 3 separate stages. Old English goes back to the 7th century. You've got to remember that this is an island, and it's only 600 miles long from John O'Groats to Land's End. That's from the top of Scotland to the bottom of England. And there's no place on the island where you can be over 100 miles away from an ocean. When there was no central government, invaders came on more than one occasion. Many of them stayed. The Jutes, for example, settled in the west. The Saxons settled in the east. And the Angles settled in the center, all the way from the Scottish border down to the River Thames. The language spoken by the Angles was that of Marcian, and it was a form of that language that was spoken here in London in that day. When William the Conqueror arrived in this land in 1066, it was only 260 years before John Wycliffe was born. And he spoke another language. He spoke French. But when they decided that they wanted a common language for the people that came in and out of the port of London, it wasn't French at its base, it was Marcian. But then it grew by stealing words from other languages. For example, they took words from the Germans, they took words from the French, they took words from the Greek. And in fact, they had two basic sets of words, because the man that worked in the field, for example, he spoke a bit lamb. But the man who was being served at the table, he spoke a bit mutton. There's no question that there were two men that greatly advanced Middle English. One was Geoffrey Chaucer. He wrote poetry, and everybody's familiar with his Canterbury Tales. The other one is John Wycliffe. He wrote in prose, and his pen was prolific. There's no question about it, these men were peers, they were friends with each other, and they greatly influenced each other. The second area that was in a state of flux was in the field of politics. Back in 1066, when William the Conqueror took over this land, he governed it through barons. These barons collected taxes and marshaled armies for him. He handed his throne to his successors, and one of them was King John. When King John inherited the crown, with it came enormous debts, and he had to enlarge on those debts because he wanted to go to war against France. But the barons were stubborn with him. He tried to avoid them. He even promised the Mohammedan king of Morocco that if they would aid him with an army, that he would become Islamic. But they didn't accept that. He couldn't go to the Pope because he had violated the Pope's laws by appointing his own Archbishop of Canterbury. In spite of all his efforts, King John was forced to come to an agreement with his barons, and they forced him to sign a document that is known as the Magna Carta in 1215. That signing took place on this island behind me by Runnymede on the River Thames. John Wycliffe would take that document, the Magna Carta, and weave it into the fabric of England's religious and political life. And one of the tools that assisted him to accomplish his task was his Bible. It is not very difficult for us to outline the 60 years that John Wycliffe lived, between 1324 to 1384. The first 16 years of his life were lived in obscurity as far as historians are concerned. And then he moved here to the city of Oxford. And when he came here, he came to be a student, and he spent the next 16 years in the pursuit of a Bachelor of Arts degree. The following 16 years, he was working on his Doctor of Divinity degree. And for the last 12 years of his life, he was here at the university for 11 of them, teaching in one of the colleges here. If you go back to the year 1167, the French had kicked the English students out of the University of Paris, and they came here to the city of Oxford in order to build a university. But the people of the city didn't like the idea. In fact, a very serious controversy erupted between the people that lived in the city of Oxford and the students that came here to study. It was so bad, in fact, that in 1209, a number of students decided to stay here no longer. They went to the city of Cambridge and they built another university. And for 600 years, there were only two universities in England, this one in Oxford and the other one in Cambridge. When Wycliffe was 24 years old, a dreaded Black Death was crawling across Europe, and it finally arrived in England. There was no cure. Its tentacles touched both rich and poor, the young and the old, and it put stark terror into the heart of Wycliffe. The people of London used the open acres of the ground at Smithfield as a common burial site, where they were actually burying 200 victims every day. They continued that daily dirge until the plague had claimed over 100,000 lives. There's no question but that those plagues had an enormous effect upon his life. In fact, two of the major factors in making the man into a reformer, one of them did relate to those plagues. It had a powerful spiritual effect upon him. I don't know why, but with the commonplace of death, he started getting a holy fear of God. And it started to get him think about his priorities. And he started reshaping what his priorities were. And he lost all his fear of men. It didn't matter to him whether it was a pope or a potentate. As far as he was concerned, truth had the highest priority of everything. That spiritual experience in his life went down into his very heart. In fact, as far as he was concerned, it touched every crevice within his soul. He was transformed and had a whole new relationship with God. The second significant thing that happened in his life was all due to the atmosphere here at Oxford University. He came here to Queen's College, but he graduated from Merton. We don't know why he changed colleges in the middle of his studies. We only know that he must have been an exceptional student. For 4 years after he got his Bachelor of Arts degree, the master's position of Balliol College was conferred upon him. And 1 year after he became the master of Balliol, he was ordained to the ministry. Then he was given an assignment by the government. The first was in Fillingham in Lincolnshire, and the second one was in Lutterworth. When I say that it was conferred by the government, you must remember that is the day when the church and the state were one and the same. And all the tithes that came into the church went into the state. And the state made the assignments for those that would be the ministers of these various parishes. Therefore, for him, it was the conference of what they called a living. There is no question but that his stay here in Oxford had an enormous effect upon his life as a reformer. You see, the way they did things in those days, the academic atmosphere was different. It wasn't a question of whether or not you could copy your notes in classroom and then reproduce them on an exam. What they did in those days was determine your gift by how you were able to defend them in public. And so debate was common, and he became a master at debate. Things then started becoming less gray and sharper black or sharper white. As far as he was concerned, right was right and wrong was wrong, and right the day must win. To doubt would be disloyalty, to falter would be sin. His great conversion experience gave him his priorities. His experience in debate gave him his definitions, and the both of them combined together gave him his convictions. There is no question about it, but that in these halls of learning, the reformer was born. About that time, a state of Cold War existed between the city of Rome and the city of Oxford, and it was being fought on two fronts. The first was in the field of politics. All the important positions of the state were being occupied by members of the clergy. And why not? They were the educated group, they were the influential group, and they were an aggressive group. But it was believed by Wycliffe that it was a calling beneath their dignity. They were called to something higher than participating in politics, on top of which it was considered poor for politics. At the same time that Wycliffe produced a tract on the subject, the Houses of Parliament presented a petition to the king, and both of them dealt with the iron grip that Rome had on the country of England. There's no question about it. Assignments were being given and positions were being held by people who were not members of this country. They lived as foreigners and they took lucrative salaries out of this country. Some of them never put their foot on the soil of England. In fact, they had their salaries brought to them. There were inferiors that were being bought, sold, and traded for favors to their ecclesiastical superiors. It wasn't so bad, but insult was added to injury when Frenchmen were being appointed to these assignments in England. Remember, that's happening at a time when England is involved in a 100-year war with France, and that only inflamed passions in this country. It was because of that that the Houses of Parliament passed two very important statutes. The first upheld that any foreign church appointments within the English realm must first get the king's approval. The second law prevented any foreign court from demanding trial or exacting a penalty of any Englishman until he was tried before an English court. It also nullified any writ demanding an Englishman to appear for trial in a foreign country unless they got permission from England's Parliament. However, 12 years later, in 1365, the Pope demanded that the British Crown pay taxes to the Church. To add insult to injury, the following year the Pope issued an order that the King of England appear in Rome and defend himself. Those decisions on the part of Rome trampled Parliament statutes. 6 years later, Rome sent an agent to collect the Pope's taxes. The agent promised Parliament that he would do nothing offensive to the king's interest. However, when he arrived with his extravagant and pompous retinue, his costly robes and large staff of accountants, Wycliffe could immediately see that he was promising what he could not perform, and he attacked him in a tract, accusing him essentially of being a liar. With Wycliffe's influence growing, within 2 years the king conferred on him the rectory of Lutterworth, and eventually he was appointed as a chaplain to the king. The other battle in this Cold War with Rome was in the field of theology. Wycliffe denounced the doctrine of transubstantiation. The doctrine was of recent innovation, dating only to 1215. The Church contended that the elements of the communion were literally transubstantiated into the actual body and blood of Christ. Wycliffe saw serious problems in the interpretation given by the Church. His examination of the issues led noble men 125 years later to die by being burned to death for their objections to this doctrine. However, with all of this, the fact that Wycliffe received his doctorate in 1372 suggests that he was not considered heretical by the Church at that time. When a sense of religious hopelessness darkened his spirit, then John Wycliffe would lecture to his students on the gross immoralities that were in the church in his day. And then he would pick up his pen and write. There's no question that his pen greatly influenced the students of Balliol College. I'm here at the moment in the dining room of the college, and it's a hall of memories. There are pictures studying all around the wall of some of the famous students of the past, among them, for example, a prime minister. When John Wycliffe realized that influencing the student body at Balliol College was not enough, it was then that he dedicated himself to using influence by the pen. You must remember that in his day there were no printing presses. Every document had to be handwritten and then painstakingly reproduced in order to circulate among the public. We don't know how many documents he did write, but we do know that there were 200 separate manuscripts that came from the pen of John Wycliffe.
The next important turn of events in the writings of Wycliffe came in 1366, when he decided with the Parliament against the tribute that was being demanded by Pope Urban V. He considered that the requests of the Pope were unconstitutional because they violated the parliamentary statute, and at the same time they were unwarranted. They created a church-state severance that required Wycliffe to stand on one side or the other. Either would he defend the church or he would defend the state. On this occasion, he believed that the church was being unfair with the state. His position brought him a great deal of favor not simply with royalty, but also with the members of the Parliament, for which, in fact, he became the chaplain to the king on November the 6th in 1375.
His pen became the weapon he so skillfully used. In his writings, he became both aggressive and strong. He declared such daring convictions as, quote, "England belongs to no pope. The pope is but a man subject to sin. But Christ is the Lord of lords, and this kingdom is held directly and solely for Christ alone." He considered the dichotomy between Rome and London irreconcilable. The point of his prolific pen was just like a sword. It was equally as cutting. It was like the tip was dipped in acid. But its greatest product was yet to come. He was going to provide a Bible in the language of common Englishmen. But before he would ever accomplish that, he had to face the fury of an offended church.
After Wycliffe wrote his Civil Dominion, then all the threats against him were going to have to become attacks. And because they knew his mouth had to be silenced, they did not know how to silence his mouth without convincing the public that he was guilty of heresy. In order to convince them he was guilty of heresy, they were going to have to put him on trial. And it was the first of these trials that was held here at St. Paul's Cathedral. 5 papal bulls were issued and were presented to Edward III, who at that time was very sick. A papal bull is a commandment that is given by the Pope. A group of mendicant monks were then given the writings of Wycliffe, and they were to go through them and try and find if there was any heresy. And they came to the conclusion that there were 19 counts of heresy. Therefore, the Pope ordered that he be placed in prison, and that he is kept there for a 3-month period of time. And then he was to appear before the Pope in Rome. However, Wycliffe took sick, and Edward III died, and the bulls became without effect in England. So another commandment was given by the Pope and was given to every member of the royal family and to the Chancellor of the Oxford University. The date was set. It was February the 19th, 1377, and it was in this building behind me where that trial was to occur. A fanatical crowd that were blindly obedient to the church came and filled the area in front of the church.
When Wycliffe arrived, it was with a small processional. He was preceded by 2 of the most powerful men in England, Lord Piercy, the Marshal of England, and John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. They bravely threaded their way through the hostile crowds, thronging the entrances of the church. Once they stepped across the threshold, there was a solid wall of people. They swayed, their hands raised in anger, and their voices hooted the Wycliffe entourage. Some angry words passed between Lord Piercy and Courtney, the chairman of the proceedings. Piercy noticed Wycliffe stood during this exchange, turned to him and said, "Sit down and rest yourself." This assumption of authority enraged the chairman, and he screamed, "It is unreasonable that one, cited to appear before a bishop, should sit down during his answer. He must and shall stand." A riot broke out, which disrupted the proceedings, and Wycliffe and his escort providentially escaped from the threatening danger. The following year, everything changed for Wycliffe. That year saw the election of a rival pope and the beginning of the 40-year Great Schism, with 2 or more popes confronting one another throughout the period. That dramatically weakened the power of the papacy, which left Wycliffe to his own devices, and he began to develop more radical ideas, which at any other time in the Middle Ages would have spelled his doom. In 1381, he published his fateful De Eucharista and followed it with his 12 propositions. These writings directly attacked the doctrine of transubstantiation. Wycliffe considered the teaching to be unscriptural and foolish to the senses. The effect of these writings caused Wycliffe to lose all his influential friends in the palace, the parliament, and at the university. Now he was alone. After another failed attempt by Wycliffe's persecutors, Wycliffe prepared for his final battle. The last trial that he had to face was in 1383. It happened here in the city of Oxford. They had convinced the king, as well as members of the parliament and even the people at the university, that he ought to be placed on trial on the subject of the Lord's Supper. It was a panel of his peers that were going to judge him, and he stood before them as one that was known as the evangelical doctor. They wanted to know if the charges against him were true, and if they were, why did he hold to such beliefs? He gave a discourse before them. They listened in silence to every word that he had to say. When he had finished making his oration, not one of them asked him a question for clarification. There was total and complete silence. He waited for instructions from them, but there were no instructions coming from them. He lifted up the material that he'd been using for his discussion. He put them back into their bag and still waited for them to give him some instruction. Without it, he simply turned his back on them, and it was the last time that they ever heard his voice in the city of Oxford. This had been his home for 43 years, and when he walked out of that trial, he never returned to Oxford again. In 1378, Wycliffe and his disciples began translating the entire Bible into the English language for the very first time. It is impossible to overestimate the influence of this remarkable work. Wycliffe maintained that the Bible contained the whole of God's revelation, that there is no need for any further teaching to be supplied by church tradition, the Pope, or any other source. Moreover, that all other authorities, traditions, and even popes must be tested by the Scriptures. And finally, that the Bible is to be available to all Christians, even to commoners. It must therefore obviously follow that the Bible be translated into the vernacular of the people. It was not a translation of the original languages, for two reasons. The manuscripts which later became available were not yet discovered, and the languages in which the original documents were written were as yet unknown in England. But Wycliffe was a good Latin scholar, and the source of his translation of Scripture was Jerome's Latin Vulgate of 405 AD. How long it took Wycliffe and his disciples to translate the New Testament, we do not know. We only know that it occurred while he was yet still teaching in Oxford, because it was completed in 1380. Assuming that the translation work took a couple of years implies that it was necessary because of the result of threats on his life at St. Paul's and later at Lambeth Palace. He verily believed that he would end his days either in a dungeon in one of the 7 hills of Rome or on a burning pile in London. He once asked, "Why do you talk of seeking the crown of martyrdom? Preach the gospel of Christ to haughty prelates, and martyrdom will not fail to find you." "What," he said, "should I live to be silent? Never. Let the blow fall, I await its coming." He deduced that life was uncertain, that no abiding effect would result from his efforts, apart from this tool, the Indestructible Book, in the hands of young preachers. In 1382, he finished the Old Testament, and for the first time in the history of England, the people had a Bible in their own language. Behind me is the parish church at Lutterworth, where John Wycliffe was the rector for the last 12 years of his life. He didn't come here permanently until he had left Oxford, and then he came to duplicate his Bibles. To reproduce one of his Bibles, all of it being handwritten, it took 10 months. And different historians give us different costs for purchasing one of those Bibles. They cost somewhere between 30 and 40 pounds. If they cost 40 pounds, then that's 9,600 pennies. And that, remember, is a day when a chicken could be bought for 2 pennies and a hog could be bought for 4 pennies. John Fox, the historian, said that people would bring a load of hay just so that they could possess one of the New Testaments for one day. And it was stated that some of them would work for a month and give the entire earnings of 1 month's labor in order to own 1 page of that Bible. I'm standing at the desk from which John Wycliffe preached for the last few years of his life. I realize that it's a modern desk by comparison, but I understand that there are fragments of it that date back to his day. Strange when you think about it, in the confines of this little podium, his voice rang out so clearly that it rippled from the top to the bottom of this nation. And when his last days came, it wasn't at this desk where it actually happened. It was in this alcove just to my left. It was on the 28th of December in the year 1384 that the famous rector of this parish conducted his last communion service of the year. In fact, it proved to be the last communion service of his life. For while he was conducting the service, he suffered a stroke, and kind providence allowed him to fall back, and he fell into this actual chair that's sitting behind me. 4 men got up from the congregation, and they quietly walked forward, and they picked up the chair from 4 corners with his body still in it, and reverently they brought it out through this side door and then across the grounds to the parsonage. It was exactly 2 days later, on the 31st of December, that he breathed his last breath. I don't think anybody will dispute the fact, but that man released an irresistible force in England. It brought light into darkness. It liberated a church. It elevated society to the extent that we feel the impact of it today over 600 years later. And in God's kind providence, we will for generations yet to come. Wycliffe could never have imagined the far-reaching impact that his influence would have after his death. Wycliffe disciples would take the Bible that he translated and, like a seed, planted throughout England. In fact, Wycliffe ideas were also influential on the continent of Europe. Some of his pupils from Oxford took copies of his work to Bohemia, which is modern-day Czechoslovakia. His teaching influenced a rise in the dissent that resulted in the burning of Don Huss in 1450. Huss was just one of an army of Wycliffites who were to be persecuted and burned at the stake. In 1428, his teachings had become so infectious that the church condemned his writings. They dug up his bones and burned them, and threw them into the little river Swift that is just beside his church at Lutterworth. They were hoping once and for all to stamp out the influence of this heretic. A later commentator to this event said, and I quote, "They burnt his bones to ashes and cast them into the Swift, a neighboring brook running hard by. Thus the brook conveyed the ashes into the Avon into the Severn into the narrow seas, and they into the main ocean." And so the ashes of Wycliffe are a powerful symbol of his teaching and his Bible, which are now spread throughout the world. After the death of Wycliffe, the people who had followed him considered themselves to be operating independent of the Roman Church. They, for example, believed in the priesthood of all believers, and they believed it was only proper that they would be allowed to administer the sacraments without the authority of a bishop. Besides that, there was a tremendous contrast between the Wycliffites and the Roman priests. The Wycliffite followers were poor people. The Roman priests had an opulence that made them obviously contrasting. When the Wycliffites went out to preach, they preached in the vernacular of people, but a Roman priest conducted services in the dead language of Latin, and that gave the Wycliffites a tremendous success publicly. They were such an enormous success that one of the critics said that if you were to meet two men walking down the streets, one of them would be a Wycliffite. And that gave them tremendous courage. Courage so that they placarded slogans and insults in all the public places. In fact, in 1395, they made a request of Parliament that they would abolish celibacy and transubstantiation and prayers for the dead and offerings unto images. In fact, they took the booklet that was written by Wycliffe on the 12 conclusions, and they nailed it in such public places as St. Paul's Cathedral and to this place behind me, which is Westminster Abbey. This caused an uproar with the bishops and clergy. This was tantamount to blasphemy against the church. In 1399, the Bishop of York aligned with King Henry VI. It was he who placed the crown on the head of this new king and stated to him at the coronation to consolidate the throne, conciliate the clergy, and sacrifice the Lollards. Lollards was an abusive term for Wycliffe's followers, meaning mumblers. Henry replied to the prelate, "I will be the protector of the church." 2 years later, in 1401, the Act for Burning Heretics was passed by the Parliament, and the Bishop of York had accomplished his counter-Reformation objectives.
It was only within 8 days of the passage of that bill that they started lighting the fires here at Smithfield, so they would burn to death those that they did not agree with. The first man that they picked him was a man by the name of William Sawtry. And William Sawtry had committed a crime. He was heard to say that he adored not the cross on which Christ died as much as the Christ who died upon the cross. And for that, they dragged him to the precincts of St. Paul's Cathedral. They shaved his head, they put on a layman's cap, and they degraded him. And then they handed him over to civil authorities so that he might have mercy extended to him. The mercy that was given by civil authorities was to bring him here to Smithfield, build a faggot of woods around his body, and burn him until he was dead. And he was only the first in a large, noble army of Wycliffites that died for their faith.
The quality of these persecuted people is exemplified by Lord Cobham. He became a disciple to Wycliffe's theology. He was brought to trial at St. Paul's on September the 23rd in 1413. When he was questioned and the shouting priest demanded that he believe, he responded, "I'm willing to believe all that God desires, but that the Pope should have authority to teach what is contrary to the Scripture, that I can never believe." He was led back to the Tower of London.
They immediately brought him back to his prison, and they gave him 40 days before his intended execution. During that 40 days, they hoped that he would recant, and his recantation would weaken the cause of the Wycliffe followers. But something amazing happened that I cannot explain. His prison was the Tower of London here behind me, and the night before his intended execution, he escaped from there. To my knowledge, nobody else has ever done that in history. And from there he went to Wales.
And he was gone for a considerable period of time until December of 1417, when he was recaptured. And then he was brought back to the area and taken to St. Giles' Field. And there they chained him to a rotisserie. And they turned him around like they would roast a hog. And before a slow burning fire, they roasted him to death.
What you are looking at is the Lollards Tower. It is attached to Lambeth Palace, which is the City of London residence for the Archbishop of Canterbury. I'd like to tell you the story of the building of that tower. A little room on the very top of it was added, which is known as the Lollards Prison. It's only 12 by 12 with a 7-foot ceiling. It has old rusty iron rings that are still attached to the wall, and where some of those prisoners, after they had been tortured, were held in chains until they were brought out to die, they left etchings on the wall. One of those etchings says, Jesus amor meus. It means that Jesus is my love. It is impossible to stand in that little room without honestly being moved to tears. The second emotional result of the constitutions of Arundel happened in the city of Norwich. There were so many of Wycliffe's followers who were publicly executed for their faith that the place of public execution to this day is known as the Lollard Pit. That's because so many Lollards died there. Now these Lollards were being burned to death all over the country. That just shows you the excessive, unbelievable number of people who were the followers of Wycliffe and who were willing to live for their faith until they died by burning.
Few crusades in human history have met with the overwhelming success that attended the followers of Wycliffe. 125 years later, they were as numerous and as active as they had been at the time when Wycliffe was living. And at that time, they started a reformation that literally turned Europe upside down. Nothing better illustrates the Renaissance than the sculpture by Bernini in the Piazza Navona. If I were to try and define the Middle Ages politically, I would have to begin at the fall of Rome and end at the discovery of America in 1492. If I were to try and define it religiously, I would begin at the conversion of Constantine and end at the publication of a Greek New Testament. But no matter how I try to define the edges of it, one thing is important. I must make a distinction in the middle. There is a difference between the Dark Ages and the Renaissance, and that came about in 3 stages. When Charlemagne became the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD, he gradually established schools for training priests and monks. He ordered manuscripts of books, especially the Bible, to be copied with extreme care. The church became the guardians of education. The movement flourished from the 11th to the 14th century and became known as scholasticism. The second stage focused attention on human achievement. It was the age of inner motivated men who emphasized human values and rational thought. This philosophy of life continued through the 16th century. The third stage that contributed to the Renaissance came in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. Thank you very much. It was only 3 years after the fall of Constantinople that the first Bible was printed here in the city of Mainz. It happened on August the 15th in 1456. And the man that was responsible for bringing it to us was a man named Johann Gutenberg. I'm sitting in a little outside cafeteria with a market behind me and the Cathedral of Mainz in the background, and around the corner from me is the Gutenberg Museum. Johann Gutenberg didn't take his name from his father. He actually took it from the place where his mother was born. But his story is a story of vision and of failure. It's a fascinating and it's a very sad story. It happens that the last of his Bibles that was sold in New York City for $5.5 million. And yet the story of his life is of vision and frustration, with millions in the bank, but not the 25 cents he needed for the taxi cab to get there and pick it up. As a boy, he entertained himself in his father's workshop by carving the separate letters of his name on soft wood. He placed them on his father's table when the H fell into a bucket of purple dye. He quickly retrieved it, and he let it rest to dry on a piece of paper. The impression it left on the paper and in his mind was indelible. This was where the concept of a printing press with movable type was born. It took some 40 years for the press to move from an idea to a reality. Building a press was expensive and required money, and it was money that he did not have. About 1450, a lawyer by the name of Johann Faust invested in Gutenberg's new enterprise. When Gutenberg ran into financial difficulties, Faust took legal proceedings against him, apparently won the case, and moved the press and tools to his own house in Mainz. There, with the assistance of Peter Schoeffer, they published various books. It is not known if the Bible had been printed previous to this court case. If it had, all its proceeds would have undoubtedly gone to Faust. He died in 1468, and he was destitute and he was forgotten. He was buried in a little Franciscan church here, but that church was demolished and another one was built in its place. And that one was demolished, and you can't find his grave today. And it's very sad, because you take one page of human history, and a man that made such a significant contribution to it is almost out of the picture altogether. A man that created a machine that literally became a guillotine to ignorance in the Middle Ages. And he's gone, and he's forgotten. You know, 30 years after his death, his machines were seen in all the major cities all over Europe. You could go anywhere from Rome to Barcelona and you could find his machines. In the city of Venice, for example, there were 151 printing shops. If you were to go to Wittenberg, there's a man there that lived by the name of Lucht, and before he died, he printed 100,000 Bibles. There's a man by the name of William Caxton who came over here to the continent on business, and while he was in the city of Cologne, he was exposed to the printing process. Fascinated him. When he went back to England, he took a printing press with him and he set it up in Westminster. He only produced 96 separate works with 18,000 pages, but he left something that caused the future reformers to dream a dream, and their dream became a reality. During this rebirth of knowledge that came to be known as the Renaissance, Greek became the important language of the humanists of that day. In October 26, 1467, a child came into the world who was to become the greatest humanist of his day. His father, who was a monk, called him Erasmus. His brother Peter and he were both illegitimate children, though his mother and his father married later in life. He was 8 years of age before he got an opportunity for education. He went to the School of the Brethren of the Common Life in a city called Deventer. And he made some important friends there, one of which was to become the future Pope. When he was 11 years of age, both his mother and father died of the plague. He eventually became a boarder at an Augustine monastery, and on April the 25th in 1492, he became an Augustinian monk. He had a gift of writing poetry, but to augment his income, he started learning and teaching Greek. He was invited to become a student of Greek at Oxford. He was welcomed by the intelligentsia, and he met a 19-year-old boy whose name was Thomas More, the future Chancellor of England. They were to become lifelong friends. More took him to the royal nursery to meet a 9-year-old Henry, who was the future King of England, known as Henry VIII. On every occasion, he dazzled and amazed his friends with his sharp mind and his keen wit. His friendships were eventually influential everywhere, even with the Pope in Rome. There's no question, but there is a missing factor in the story. This man became so popular. What was it that created his popularity? Unquestionably, it was his pain. And that's what brings me here to the city of Brussels. And I'm here because this is a house in which he lived that had been built back in the middle of the 15th century out of Flemish brick. And he's not the only notable person that lived here, because a friend of his that later became the Pope in Rome also lived in this house. And today it's a museum. And this museum is the largest single collection of his writings that we can find in any single place in the world today. What writings? You remember we talked previously about the poems that were written in the 1490s. And then that gave way to the Manual of the Christian Soldier. In that work, he didn't mean to condemn the church. He just wanted to point out to them that the dogma and the ritual of the church was irrelevant to the day in which he lived. And it was the first kind of writing by a notable person that had been done. And oh, what a reaction it brought. You see, all the men that were hungry for the Reformation immediately caught on to it. So much so that William Tyndale, for example, translated it into English, had it printed, and then circulated at his own expense. Then, you remember in 1505, he's living in the home of Sir Thomas More in London, and he writes his In Praise of Folly. It was his analysis of the church of his day. He believed that they were simply servants or slaves, if you would, to folly itself. And that included kings and bishops and princes and even popes. That's the reason for which, when you look at some of this literature here, you'll see sections of it inked out, crossed over. The people that belonged to the Church of Rome in his day were very concerned about what he was doing, believing that he was actually feeding what would ultimately divide the church. And there's no question about it, it did divide the church. But that brought us down to the most significant work that he wrote in his lifetime. The year is 1516. He started doing his translation of the Greek New Testament previously. He had finished it while he was a teacher at Queen's College in Cambridge, and that tower, named the Erasmus Tower, is dedicated to him because that's the place where he terminated his translating work. Then he put it together on a page, for example, divided in two. On one half he put the Greek text, and on the other half he put his Latin translations. And then he dedicated the entire work to Pope Leo X. That kind of secured for him at least the outward favor of the church and promised him that he'd be able to sell the product. Unfortunately, it was banned in most countries almost immediately. But you see what happened? It just fell like seed on the ground. There's no other way to describe it, because Martin Luther got a look at it and then decided he could translate that Greek into the German of his day, and he gave the Germans a Bible. That's exactly the thing that Zwingli and Calvin did for the people that lived in Switzerland. That's exactly the same thing that William Tyndale did for the people that lived in England. And then it went through editions. It was the 4th and 5th edition, according to Philip Schaff, the church historian, that became the Textus Receptus. And if you're not familiar with that term, That's the document that the translators of the King James Version of the Bible in 1611 used to do their translation from. No, before I conclude, I've got to admit, Erasmus did not intend to split the church. As far as he was concerned, the conflagration that came was not coming with his purpose or intent. But he was standing in the dry timber, and he was playing with matches. He himself admitted that he laid the egg, and Luther hatched it. One man stands above all others when you talk about the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. He was the very center of this religious cleavage with the Church of Rome, but he was also to play a vital role in the story of the Bible. Martin Luther was born on November the 10th in 1483. He entered the Augustinian monastery and had already earned his B.A. and his M.A. A year later, he took his vows to become a monk. In 1511, he was transferred to the monastery at Wittenberg and became a professor of biblical literature. A priest by the name of John Titzel was selling indulgences. Indulgences were a form of penance by price, allowing people to purchase a piece of paper which afforded them the right to commit sins, the degree of which was determined by the price they paid. Luther strongly resented the practice. At the same time, he was lecturing on the book of Romans. He discovered the verse in Romans 1:17. He concluded that a man in Christ, through faith, may have the righteousness of God transferred to his credit. There was no need of indulgences or other forms of penance. This became his great conversion experience. It was the combination of these things which led to the famous 95 Theses, which were nailed to the castle church door at Wittenberg in 1517. In these theses, he severely attacked the church. He took issue with every doctrine that was not founded on the Scriptures. In 1520, Pope Leo X issued a bull requiring him to recant under the threat of excommunication. In 1521, at an assembly at Worms, he gave his immortal statement, "Here I stand, my conscience is captive to the Word of God." This is the actual location of this landmark meeting. Then on December 10, 1521, he publicly burned the papal bull. His pen became very active. His publications attacked the doctrines of the church that he felt were at odds with the Scripture. I'm standing in a room where this man lived. He walked through this door. He stepped on these wooden boards. He warmed himself at that furnace. And there is no question about it, he needed friends, sacred and secular. And these writings accomplished that purpose. There were other treatises that were going to be written afterward, and the greatest of them was his theological contribution, which he titled The Bondage of the Will. He printed that in 1525. It was done in response to a vicious attack by the humanist Desiderius Erasmus. That same year, when he was 42 years of age, there was a peasants' revolt, and he had to write a denial of association. In fact, he wrote an inflammatory condemnation of the revolt. It was in the same year that he married Catherine von Bora. I'm sitting amidst the furniture that Luther sat amidst. He sat on these chairs. He sat by this table. If any guests were in his house, it was from this table that he led his evening devotions. And there's no question he was a reformer. A rebel is a person that tries to change the past. A reformer is a person that tries to change the future. And every religious reformer knows that you can't affect succeeding generations unless you provide them with a Bible in their own vernacular. That makes the years important for his pen, the years preceding September of 1522, when for the first time for Luther of printing presses in the German language came a New Testament.
His most important work was the translation of the German Bible. It was a translation from the Erasmus Greek New Testament. In his arrangement, Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation were placed at the end of the publication as non-canonical. He did not believe that they could claim the right of inspiration. Within the first 14 years of the completion of that Bible, it, or portions of it, went through 377 editions.
He taught the world how to protest against the evils of popes and potentates of that day. And not only protest, but make it permanent. And he did that by providing a Bible in the language that everybody understood.
Luther wasn't the only champion of the European Reformation. Ulrich Zwingli was responsible for translating the Zurich Bible for the people of Switzerland. If Lutheranism was born in Wittenberg, then Presbyterianism was born in Geneva. John Calvin was the most notable pioneer of this reform. He was without parallel in the area of theology. The other reformers wrote and argued doctrine, but not to the measure and depth characteristic of Calvin. He also built the only university for the training of Reformed ministers and made Geneva the capital city of the Reformed movement. Calvin ruled Geneva with an iron fist. Now the Protestants took their turn at persecuting. 58 executions occurred. In fact, 34 women were burned on a suspicion of spreading the plague by magical means. Geneva became the Rome of Protestantism for some 6,000 refugees from England, Scotland, and France.
I'm sitting here on a bridge that goes over the River Calm in Cambridge. And I'm thinking about some great rivers of which we're not sure where the source is. And as it is with rivers, it is certainly true of great movements. There's no question when you talk about the Reformation and you think of Germany, you automatically think of Martin Luther. In Switzerland, it's Ulrich Zwingli or John Calvin. In Scotland, it's John Knox. But in England, the source of that movement was really the Indestructible Book. There's no question in our mind that there were certain personalities that helped it along, striding in its progress. And if we try to find the initiator of those personalities, it's probably a little man by the name of Thomas Bilney.
Bilney was born in the city of Norwich around 1495. He was a student at Trinity Hall in Cambridge, majoring in the field of canon law. Two factors left an uneasy balance in Bilney's life. First, Bilney's religious life was barren and non-productive. Fastings, vigils, and indulgences had left him with empty pockets, empty health, and an empty heart. Secondly, the Erasmus Greek New Testament had crossed his path. Published the previous year, it had survived the blacklist ban placed on it and was known to be in the religious subculture of Cambridge. One night he went out and he bought a black market copy of that Erasmus Greek New Testament. He came to the words of Paul in 1 Timothy 1:15, which stated that Christ came to this world to save sinners, and he admitted that he was the worst. Those words shot through his heart. On the spot, he trusted in the Christ of those pages. Doubt gave way to assurance,
and an effervescent joy dominated his heart. He had to share his newfound faith with others. He picked the white horse in for the field in which to sow his seed. It was a pub where the academic superiors of Cambridge assembled and discussed subjects prohibited in the classroom. It was nicknamed Little Germany because it discussed so much of Luther's writings. Bilney brought his New Testament to their discussion tables. The result was cataclysmic. The news spread through Cambridge and began to attract notable lecturers from the university. But these men were being converted by their exposure to Bilney's New Testament. This small group of men was eventually to produce 2 archbishops and 8 martyrs. But among these notable academicians was a young man by the name of William Tyndale. Tyndale was no ordinary student. Born in 1494, we know that he graduated with his master's in 1515 from Magdalen Hall in Oxford. At this time, Thomas Wolsey, the Archbishop of York, was waging an all-out assault on the reformers. In fact, in 1517, at Little Park in Coventry, 5 men and 2 women were tried for heresy. The charge was that they were teaching their children the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments in English. They were found guilty and burned to death in the public square. Wolsey was also relentless in his search for forbidden books at Oxford. The influence of the Lollards was still strongly felt in Oxford, and Wolsey sought to destroy every forbidden book that he could get his hand on. When Tyndale heard about Bilney's White Horse Inn Fellowship in 1519, he left Oxford for the more tolerant Cambridge and became associated with this secretive Bible study group. It was here in Cambridge that Tyndale discovered the spellbinding and regenerating power of the Bible. He knew that the revival was confined to Cambridge only because of its culture. And if the ordinary man cannot rise to the culture of Cambridge, then the Bible must step down to the level of ordinary understanding. Thus, the task of his life and the cause of his death was to translate the Bible into the language of the common man. He was an excellent Greek scholar, and he was also a great debater of the Scriptures. A certain clergyman taunted Tyndale by saying, "We were better to be without God's law than the Pope's." Tyndale fired back, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spares my life ere many years, I will cause the boy that drives the plow to know more about the Scriptures than you." At the age of 30, he decided that the mission of his life would be to translate the Bible into English. He may have never realized that this project would eventually earn him the title, the Father of the English Bible. He became employed by the John Walsh family at Little Sodbury Manor in the Cotswon Hills near Bristol, the area from which he came. He became the chaplain of Sir John Walsh and his wife, and the tutor of their 2 children. And it was in this home where he started the assignment of translating the Greek into English. This little attic room happens to be the private room of William Tyndale while he worked for the Walsh family. Here he slept, and here he kept his books, and here he studied. The idea came to him that if the Greek New Testament had such a profound effect upon the scholastic world, what would an English Bible do for plowboys? At this very spot, he decided he was going to translate the Greek New Testament into English. He appealed to the Bishop of London, Cuthbert Tunstall, to rescind the law passed against the Lollards forbidding any use of Scripture other than in Latin. But it was futile. Tyndale therefore determined to exile himself from his native land, and he set sail for the continent to accomplish his great mission. Tyndale traveled to Wittenberg to finish the translation of the New Testament. Luther and Tyndale were strongly united by the same motto, Sola Scriptura, only the Scriptures. The city became a refuge for the outlaw. The printing was the most difficult task of all. In Cologne, they found a willing printer. English spies broke up the operation, coming through the front door while Tyndale escaped through the back with whatever copies were finished. It was a narrow escape. They then traveled to Worms, where they found another willing printer. In December 1525, they accomplished the task, and the New Testaments were ready for shipping. He had made good friends with the London port authorities, and they determined the best way to smuggle this forbidden book into the country was by placing them in sacks of flour that were being imported into England. Thousands of Tyndale's Bibles were reaching the shore of England, and the words of the English translation were fermenting a national unrest. Today you can see a statue of Tyndale that overlooks the port where his Bibles reached England. The opposition which came to the Reformed movement in England came from the established church, from the crown, and from humanism. The religious opposition was expected, as the two forces were antagonistic in every respect. The established church came to be caricatured in the person of Thomas Wolsey, the last Roman Catholic prelate to rule over England. His power and wealth was graphically illustrated by the incredible home which he built for himself called Hampton Court. It was even larger than the royal residence.
He was a devout Roman Catholic, and he was sold out lock, stock, and barrel for the advancement of that church in this country. To that end, he became the leader of a crusade to stamp out heretics, and that caused good and godly men to lose their property, to languish in prison, and some of them even to burn at a stake.
In the meantime, Henry VIII was the other voice of opposition to the reformers. He was strongly opposed to the Lollards and the cause of the Reformation. In fact, the Pope had declared him the protector of the Church. Sir Thomas More became the third voice of opposition. More was an ideal Catholic. He submitted to fasts and vigils, scourged himself every Friday. He would sleep on the bare ground using a log for a pillow. He eventually became the Chancellor of England, the first layman ever to hold this powerful office. He strongly denounced Tyndale's doctrine, especially his English Bible. More determined that Tyndale must be assassinated. In 1528, Bishop Tunstall licensed More to refute the works of Tyndale in what became known as the Pen and Ink Wars. Tyndale's New Testament was having such an impact on the nation that the king condemned them to public burning at St. Paul's Cross, harassed and persecuted all found guilty of possessing or distributing them, and even raised money to buy out Tyndale's operation.
It was Tunstall who authorized Augustine Packington, a merchantman that did a lot of trade in Antwerp, to go over to the continent, buy every Bible available to be bought, bring it back here to St. Paul's Cathedral, and have it publicly burned. What Tunstall didn't know was that Packington was a friend of William Tyndale's,
and he paid him 4 times the cost of production for every Bible he bought, which means that for every Bible that they burned here at St. Paul's, he paid to have it replaced and then added 3 more to Tyndale's arsenal. Tyndale's Bible was just the tool that the pioneer reformers needed. Bilney, who was the initiator of this revolution, undoubtedly relied on this precious book. But in 1527, he was arrested while preaching in Ipswich. They put him in a cell in the Tower of London, but they left the door open, and they played a cat-and-a-mouse game with him. They let his friends come in and out to try and dissuade him from becoming a martyr, and they succeeded. On December the 7th in 1527, he signed an abjuration, and the following day was a Sunday. They walked him that morning through public thoroughfare all the way from the Tower of London to St. Paul's Cathedral. When he got here, he listened to a sermon that denounced his heresy, and at this very location, they had a stack of William Tyndale's Bibles, and it was his job to ignite the Bibles and burn them. That event shattered his soul. It demented his spirit. He made his mind up that he was going to get arrested again. And in Norwich, in 1531, he accomplished that. Though he was tried in London, he was sentenced to be executed here in the city of Norwich, because this was the place where he held his greatest influence. And he spent his last night on earth, on August the 8th, 1531, in this damp, dark cell that was built in 1407. They had a table spread where he was sitting eating his last meal, just on the other side of that pillar. Five of his friends came to visit him to try and comfort and console him. They were led by Matthew Parker, who was later to become the Archbishop of Canterbury under the reign of Elizabeth I. They came down that spiral, narrow staircase. They filed over to the end of the table where he was eating his meal, and they gave him words to try and fortify him. He didn't need fortification. He was totally committed to die for Christ. Had they offered him a pardon, it would only have disappointed him. The more they spoke about the flames being cooled by the Spirit of God, quietly he finished his meal. When he had completed, he pushed the plate apart, got a finger on his Bible and pulled it down the table to where they were sitting. And in their dumb silence, unexplained, he simply rested his elbow on the table, put his index finger out and held it over the open flame of a candle. And he held it there until it burned his finger to the bone. As they watched in silence, he pointed toward the open Bible on the table beside him and read the reference he'd just been reading before in Isaiah 43 verse 2, "When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned." He commented that to burn for any other reason than dying for Christ would burn. But with Christ in the flames, they don't burn. And it was in that frame of mind he spent his last night in this cell. As they took him from the cell, they crossed the Bishop's Bridge, and he ran to embrace the stake and thank God for the privilege of having a second opportunity to die for Christ. He was a noble example for his contemporaries. First, he taught the reformers how to live for Christ, and then he taught them how to die for him. When men were beheaded, usually gentlemen, it was normally done at Tower Hill. When they were hanged, usually common people, it was done at Tyburn. And when they were burned, those guilty of religious crimes, it was done at Smithfield. A statue should be erected to the noble men and women that burned to death here at Smithfield. They were all courageous, but some of them exemplified uncommon valor. They were human. That must be remembered. They were as human as you are, as I am. Their bodies were subject to pain. Their bones were as brittle as ours. They floated on waves of emotion. Sometimes it took them up to ecstatic heights, and sometimes it dropped them down to the deepest valleys of despair. Some of them were not taken against their will. They consented to their ordeal. They did so because they had convictions that went like shafts of steel into their soul, and it wouldn't let them bend to pressure. Or some of them were weak, and they recanted. But then they found the courage to refortify themselves and turn around and face the ordeal all over again. Some of them were strong, burly, stout men. Some of them were weak, fragile, sensitive women. But all of them were heroes. The cause of the Reformation and the story of the English Bible hold a great debt of gratitude, ironically, to the carnal passions of King Henry VIII. His first marriage with Catherine of Aragon had produced 6 children, but only one girl survived infancy, the future Bloody Mary. King Henry blamed Catherine for the failure to provide him a son. Then her fate was sealed when the king cast his eyes on a young woman by the name of Anne Boleyn. She had an oval face, bright eyes, black hair. She walked with dignity. It said that she had a sweet singing voice, and she danced elegantly. Whenever the king was despondent, it was always her songs and her laughter that cheered him up and attracted him like a magnet. He wrote letters to her, but most of them were in French. In them he admitted that he had a deep love for her, but she had no intention of becoming his mistress. When he saw the resolute of her morals, he then proposed marriage to her. But his divorce had not yet been complete, so she declined. When he appealed to her father to help him in the proposal, the father encouraged her, and she decided that if he would ever get a divorce, she would become his wife. It must be realized that a divorce from Catherine, followed by a Protestant queen, was tantamount to a break with Rome. Cardinal Wolsey could see the writing on the wall. He was unable to convince the king that he shouldn't seek the divorce, and equally unable to convince him that he shouldn't marry Anne. And he knew as inevitable as the fall of gravity that it would mean his fall from grace. One historian put it, and I think put it well. He said 1,000 Wolseys was not worth one Anne Boleyn. When the Pope, for various political reasons, did not grant the divorce, Wolsey saw that he had lost his influence, and the king replaced Wolsey with Sir Thomas More. The king, upset that the church would not grant him a divorce from Catherine, made a monumental decision that was to sever its relationship with Rome. In 1534, Parliament passed an act denoting the king to be the sole and supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Sir Thomas More could not subscribe to this decision. He was arrested and put in the Tower. He spent 1 year there and refused to recant. For this he became known as the man for all seasons. He was placed on trial for high treason, and 7 days later was executed outside the Tower. A man by the name of Thomas Cranmer was to play a significant role in the continuing story of the Indestructible Book. In 1533, he had been consecrated as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He defended the king's decision. It was he that declared the marriage to Catherine null and void. On June the 1st, 1535, Cranmer crowned Anne Boleyn as queen and became the godfather of their daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth. When Tyndale's New Testaments had reached the shores of England, there were many in the church, and one on the throne that thought the only way to stop him was to have him burned. Bounty hunters from England were traveling all over the continent, wearing disguises and paying for information, but all without success. He began the translation of the Old Testament. He eventually moved to Antwerp. Even though the king had severed from the Catholic Church, he was still very much opposed to Tyndale. Tyndale soon learned what it was like to be the fox out in the country, surrounded by the hound. It didn't take him long to learn how to live like a fugitive and to wander like a vagabond from city to city, like this German city behind me, and sometimes cross over the boundaries into other countries. He wore many different disguises, and what made him particularly difficult to locate was the fact that he spoke 7 languages with such fluency that you couldn't determine which one was his native tongue. And I deeply and sincerely feel for the man, though he's in a page of history. I do so because I know that he must have lived with fears and with trepidation that was part of his life, day after day, if not hour after hour. In 1535, while he was in Antwerp, Henry Phillips, posing as a friend, betrayed the identity of the reformer. He was captured, taken into custody, and imprisoned in the impregnable Vilvoorde Castle near Brussels in Belgium. He was found guilty of sacrilege, but it was not until Friday, October the 6th in 1536 that they brought him out to exact his capital punishment. This monument commemorates that historic event. It was not until Friday, October 6th in 1536 that they brought him from his cell to the place of public execution. There was no reticence, there was no regret, there was no hesitation. When they brought him to the stake against which he was going to be chained and burned to death, he noticed that it had one unique feature about it. There were 2 holes in the stake through which a piece of wire was to be threaded that went around his neck, because according to the court, he had to be strangled at the same time that he was going to be burned. And when the executioner was putting the wire through the hole and marking it around his throat, he made his last recorded public statement. And his statement was in the form of a prayer. Lord, open the King of England's eyes. They strangled his voice, they burned his hand, they ravaged and destroyed his property, burning every Bible they could find. Though only one of his first edition New Testaments has survived the biblical Holocaust, his commitment inspired thousands. His priorities gave guidance to the movement, and his translation influenced every succeeding one, until 90% of his work filtered unchanged into the best-selling book of all time, the King James Version of 1611.
After the death of Tyndale, the English Bible was considered a forbidden book. It would take a combination of political maneuvers to clear the way for an authorized English Bible. King Henry VIII was never a Protestant at heart. It was all an issue of political expediency. However, his new queen, Anne Boleyn, was a devoted believer in the Reformed movement. Her views were not covered in secrecy. She made efforts to exert influence on Secretary Cromwell to overlook the crimes of some caught smuggling Tyndale's New Testaments into England. In fact, she cordially received a specially bound copy of such a New Testament, sent to her while Tyndale was a prisoner at Bilboa, and today it is preserved in the British Museum. She appointed Matthew Parker, a noted reformer, to become chaplain to her daughter Elizabeth. Finally, Anne promoted another worthy reformer named Hugh Latimer to become the king's chaplain. It seemed that the Reformation had finally established a firm foundation that they could build upon. But the passions of the king turned once again, desire toward another lady at the court, Jane Seymour. These circumstances so troubled Anne that she gave premature birth to a stillborn son. One day in January of 1536, she walked into a room and unexpectedly found them in a compromising position. She had expected something to happen, but what and when?
A festival had been arranged in the city of Greenwich on May the 1st, 1536. It was going to be a gala occasion. The bleachers were filled with people waiting on joisters to entertain them. The king and queen was present. The queen accidentally dropped a handkerchief, and a man by the name of Henry Norris, one of the chief joisters, picked it up and he wiped his brow with it. The king took the occasion to leave the place in a rage. It was quite obvious that he was very disturbed, and that only caused anxiety with the queen. She didn't know what it was that disturbed him. She tried to find out, but without success. It wasn't until the next morning, when she saw Kingston, the lieutenant of the Tower, that she put the pieces together and realized what was happening and let out a scream. They brought her down on a barge from the River Thames to the Traitor's Gate in the entrance into the Tower, and they made her occupy the same suite of rooms that she did during the coronation ceremonies.
When Archbishop Cranmer heard of her arrest, he was stunned. He could not accept the charges brought against her. 3 gentlemen, including the young man who picked up her handkerchief, were interrogated, accused of acts of adultery with the Queen. Each in turn strongly denied the charges, but when one was put on the body rack, he quickly agreed to any statements they wished. They were all sentenced to death, including the Queen.
It was 11 o'clock in the morning on May the 19th that Anne quietly left her rooms, went into the courtyard of the Tower behind me, put her head on a block of wood. It was a Frenchman that performed the ceremonies, he with his attendants, and as he had promised her, he severed her head with one blow of the axe. A cannon was shot from the tower to notify the king, who had been hunting in ground somewhere in the vicinity, to let him know that she was dead. It was November of 1527 when Bilney was arrested, and at his trial in London, the metaphorical closet doors opened and the skeletons fell out. The first problem that he faced was caused by a man named Thomas Garrett. He was found black marketing 350 Bibles here into Cambridge, and that put all of Bilney's friends under suspicion. In fact, it led to their arrest. That only compounded difficulties for John Frith, because in Oxford, a man by the name of John Clark was found reading his Bible in his own bedroom to several other students. That led to the arrest and suspicion of all the other friends of Bilney that were in Oxford. And among the students that were arrested was John Frith. The group were imprisoned in a cave beneath the college. Within 7 months, 4 of them had died because of the deplorable conditions. When they were released, they were commanded to carry faggots to the top of Carfax and burn a collection of forbidden books. Frith managed to escape this punishment and cross the English Channel to Antwerp. There he met Tyndale, and a close bond of friendship developed between them. While he was away from England, he wrote and published numerous manuscripts and demonstrated forceful logic. His knowledge of the Scripture and his forthright attacks on Roman doctrines were unanswerable. We're never told why, but Frith crossed the Channel back to England and was eventually taken to the Tower. 2 other secret reformers, Cromwell and Cranmer, held him as a prisoner of the Crown. It secured certain privileges and liberties. During this time, Frith conducted a debate from his cell through the printing presses with no less an enemy of the Reformation as Sir Thomas More, the Chancellor of England. Refusing many opportunities and encouragements to escape, he was taken to St. Paul's Cathedral on June the 20th, 1533. He was tried, he was condemned, and he was relocated at the infamous Newgate prison, which is just behind me. It was while he was in the prison that he met a 24-year-old tailor by the name of Andrew Hewitt, and the 2 men, sentenced to the same punishment for the same crimes, became close friends. And on the 4th of July, 1533, they brought the 2 of them here to Smithfield. They chained them back to back with the stake between them, and they died. He had only just turned 30 years of age, and the spirit and body of John Frith parted company here in Smithfield. Smithfield was to claim many more men and women who were devoted to the Reformation and their love for the English Bible. John Nicholson, referred to as Lambert, was put on trial for his doctrinal differences of the Lord's table. On November 16th, in 1538, he was tried and convicted at Westminster Hall. 4 days later, he was burned at Smithfield. The winds were contrary. The fire was kept low, burning the lower legs to stubs. He had to hang to the chains. Soldiers became impatient and thrust lengthy spears into his side. By this time the hands were on fire. He held them out towards the people, and he shouted, "None but Christ, none but Christ." Although Tyndale had never finished the translation of the Old Testament, John Rogers picked up his pen and, using the alias of Thomas Matthews, finished the work. Then he sent the documents to a printer in England. The printer was so impressed with the work that he sent them to Archbishop Cranmer to see if he could get official approval. The Archbishop indirectly presented these documents to King Henry, and miraculously, he gave official approval for an English Bible to be printed in England for the very first time. With the exception of part of the Old Testament, This was really Tyndale's translation of the Bible. In fact, at the end of the book of Malachi, William Tyndale's initials are proudly displayed. This was only 3 years after Tyndale's final prayer, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." The footnotes in the Matthew's Bible were strongly anti-Catholic, and this did not help foreign relations. Cromwell, the Secretary of State, decided that another Bible must be printed. Miles Coverdale softened the footnotes from the previous Bible, and in 1539 the Great Bible was finished. The Great Bible was but an edition of Tyndale's outlawed translation. Here it was on the streets, with absolute freedom, dressed in a new suit. A royal declaration was made. It was to be bought by every parish church in the land, and a time limit was given for the purchase. Once the time passed, the price doubled every month, until every church in England possessed a copy of the English Bible. It must be kept within access of the public, at any hour the public wished to read it. The church was also to provide a reader for those who were unable to read. The Bible was not a gift to the public by the church, but by the king. King Henry was central, and on either side of him stood Cranmer and Cromwell, by whom it was to be distributed through the priests to the people. This became the English Bible for the next 20 years. Though Tyndale's ashes lay scattered in a foreign land without even a burial, if anything, this Bible should be his tombstone. The Great Bible was in every respect the fruit of his labor and the memorial of his life. Henry VIII was the husband of 6 wives, the lover of several concubines, and the father of many illegitimate children. Only 3 legitimate children survived infancy: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. In 1546, Edward automatically became the heir of the throne at 9 years of age. The prevailing influence of his life was the Reformed faith. He was Protestant to the core, and the cause of the Reformers seemed firmly established. However, his health was poor, and after only 6 years on the throne, he died. The male line finished. The eldest daughter, Mary, inherited the throne. She was as committed to the Catholic faith as her stepbrother had been to the Protestant faith. She believed that it was her right to conduct the Mass in her own private chapel, and if anybody made an issue of that, she appealed to her cousin, Charles V, and Charles V threatened to go to war on the issue of her religious freedom. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and her mind was crowded with the events of misfortune that befell her mother in her childhood. Because her mother's marriage was considered illegal, she was considered a bastard child, and at times she was required to be a lady-in-waiting to her younger half-sister Elizabeth. She was 20 years of age when her mother died, but they wouldn't allow her into the room to see her mother. They wouldn't give her a moment of quietness to be able to say goodbye to her mother. Her life was filled with harassment, and even with the threat of murder. Mary displayed a gentle disposition at the beginning of her reign, but attitudes and pressures changed. Mary's religious zeal soon became evident, and a dark cloud fell on the Reformers' cause in England. She vowed vengeance on Archbishop Cranmer, who approved the divorce of her mother to Henry VIII, making her illegitimate, and changed England to a Protestant faith. Cranmer, along with Nicholas Ridley, the Bishop of London, and Latimer, were all arrested.
reading of the Bible was again banned in England, and a migration of people of the Reformed faith filled the free cities of Europe. But John Rogers, a prebendary of St. Paul's, was obstinate. He preached at St. Paul's on the true doctrine taught in King Edward's days. He warned his congregation against any reversal to pestilent popery, as he called it. 10 days later, he was arrested.
Many of the people who were awaiting their execution here in the city of London were kept at the Tower of London. But many of them were kept on this site behind me, which today is Old Bailey, the chief criminal court in Britain, but in that day was the infamous Newgate prison. It was just 9 days before Thomas Hooper was executed in Gloucester on the 4th of February 1555, that a man by the name of John Rogers was kept here and was walked down that street to Smithfield to be burned to death. You may remember the name of John Rogers because he was also known by the alias of Thomas Matthews. He was an assistant to William Tyndale, and he's the man that produced the Matthews Bible. That was only 18 years before this event. When he was taken from this prison down to Smithfield, there was a large company of people waiting to see him, and among them his wife and his children. And he was the father of many children, but he wasn't allowed to say a word to one of them. 6 days later, he had to face a committee appointed by Cardinal Pole, and Gardiner condemned him to die. The reason for his condemnation was that he refused to accept the Christian character of the Church of Rome, and refused to accept that the elements of the Lord's Supper converted into the actual body and blood of Christ. It was February the 4th, 1555, when they brought him here to Smithfield to die by being burned to death. He was the first of 300 men who sacrificed their lives for that purpose during the reign of Bloody Mary. And Bradford, who was going to suffer the same judgment as he had, made a comment from his prison. He said he broke the ice valiantly.
Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of London, and Hugh Latimer were probably the English Reformation's most famous martyrs. Ridley was Archbishop Cranmer's chaplain. He strongly supported Cranmer's Protestant position. His theology of the Eucharist influenced the Book of Common Prayer. Hugh Latimer started as a zealous Catholic, and it was Thomas Bilney at Cambridge that was crucial in the conversion of this extraordinary preacher. Bilney asked Latimer to hear his confession. For 2 hours in the confessional, Bilney confessed his love for the Scriptures and the comfort and confidence that they brought to his heart. Latimer was moved to tears and became a powerful preacher of Protestantism. He was arrested during the end of Henry's reign for his objections to Catholic theology. However, when Edward ascended the throne, he was released.
It was 1553 when Bloody Mary came to the throne, and he was subpoenaed once again to appear before a tribunal at Westminster. He could have escaped this time and gone to the continent, but he decided not to. In 1554, he occupied a cell at the Tower of London, and 2 of his friends were in that cell with him, Ridley, the Bishop of London, and Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. They were then transferred here to the city of Oxford, and specifically to St. Mary's Church, where they were tried.
Both Latimer and Ridley were interrogated about the elements of the Lord's Supper that oppose Catholic theology, but they stood firm. Ridley, entering the place of execution first, held up both hands toward heaven.
When he saw Latimer with a cheerful look, he ran to him and embraced him, saying, "Be of good heart, brother, for God will either assuage the fury of the flames or else strengthen us to abide it." Then both of them went to the stake, and kneeling down, prayed with great fervor. After listening to a sermon that scathingly denounced them, they were chained to the stake and the timber was ignited. When the flames were coming up around him, the old man Latimer turned to his younger friend and he said to him, "Master Ridley, play the man. We shall this day light a candle by God's grace in England that shall never be put out." The old man Latimer was 70 years of age when his lifeless body slumped over the chains above the dying embers. It was the Indestructible Book that changed his life. It comforted him in distress. He lived to preach it. And that same book changed all England. Archbishop Cranmer was then ordered to stand trial. In 1556, he was degraded from office by a special Roman commission. It was designed to humiliate. His priestly tunic and stole were stripped from his body. A barber shaved his head. He'd been torturously worn down. The previous October, he had been forced to witness the horrific burnings of Latimer and Ridley. He finally faltered and wrote 5 recantations. Queen Mary and Cardinal Pole still maintained that he must be burned, but only after he made public declaration of his faith. It was raining on March the 21st, 1556, and they moved the formalities indoors to St. Mary's Church. Cole condemned his crimes and then called on Cranmer to make his public confession. But it wasn't until he reached the middle of his profession that he took a 180-degree turn. He said, "I renounce and refuse as things written with my hand contrary to the truth in my heart, and written for fear of death. And for as much as my hand offended in writing contrary to my heart, therefore my hand shall first be punished. For if I may come to the fire, it shall be first burned." As Cranmer went on to decry the Pope and the sacraments, Cole ordered Cranmer taken away. But they had a hard time keeping up with the old man as he rushed himself to the stake. He bade his friends farewell, and the fire was kindled at his feet. Cranmer stretched out his right hand into the flame and said, "This hand hath offended." Only once he withdrew it to wipe his face, and then he returned it until it burned to a stump. His last words were, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." He then collapsed and was consumed by the flame. 2 years later, and after 300 people had been burned to death, Bloody Mary died of poor health. On November the 17th, 1558, Elizabeth, her stepsister, ascended the throne. During her coronation, she was presented with the English Bible. She graciously received it, publicly kissed it, and promised to read it often. In 1559, she reenacted what her brother Edward VI had done before her, that one book of the whole Bible should be set up in every parish. While Bloody Mary was still on the throne, the reformers in Geneva employed their time
by producing another translation of the Scriptures into English. It was completed in 1560 and was called the Geneva Bible. It was a unique Bible in that it was the first produced by a group or committee rather than by an individual. The group included John Knox, Miles Coverdale, William Withingham, and other lesser-known authorities. These men had access to John Calvin when they needed important input. Their source of material was greater than any afforded to a previous translator. They painstakingly worked on every minute detail. This method of translation was later adopted by the committees who worked on the King James Version. Though it was never sanctioned for public use in England, it quickly became the household Bible because of its convenient size. It was particularly the Puritans' Bible and became the Bible of the Commonwealth Army. In 1559, Elizabeth, now reigning queen, appointed Matthew Parker as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the master of Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. At his insistence, a new English Bible was needed. It has been called the fourth revision of the Tyndale translation. It was also the result of a committee, this time of 8 or 9 bishops. This became known as the Bishop's Bible.
His Bible was really needed, so he believed, because of the growing influence of the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was actually causing 2 problems. In the first place, it was replacing the authority of the authorized version, which was the great Bible in that day. In the second place, it was really undermining the authority of the bishops. Now, when Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne and the reformers came back from under the influence of John Calvin, a movement known as Puritanism began in England. That movement for Puritanism fostered another movement. That movement was toward nonconformity. Once they started stressing purity, and they were asking for purity in the lives of the clergy, that really focused on the bishops of that time. The end result of it was there was really an investigation to try and find a new form of church administration.
The movement alarmed Archbishop Parker because it threatened to undermine the respect that people would show to the clergy. He felt this new translation would re-establish their prestige. While they followed the Great Bible in the historical sections, the prophetical books carried the distinct influence of the Geneva Bible. It was costly and cumbersome. Its ecclesiastical terms were unsuited to the average man. The Bishop's Bible survived for 40 years and 20 editions. It was considered the weakest of all the Reformation Bibles. At the death of Elizabeth, a childless queen, James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, became the next heir to the throne of England. Unlike his mother, he was brought up with strong Protestant convictions. Scotland, reformed by John Knox, was Presbyterian to the core. So before he ever arrived in London, James was met by a party who presented him with the millenary petition.
This was a request signed by 800 Puritan clergymen, and they were asking the king to remove certain religious rituals, such as the signing of the cross at baptism. And that caused James II to call for an investigation into those things pretending to be amiss within the church. And the meeting was held here at Hampton Court in 1604.
On the third day of these meetings, Dr. John Reynolds, the leader of the Puritan group, argued that the existence of the bishop's Bible was an acknowledgement to the inferiority of other translations when compared to the Geneva edition. His logic was invincible. Either make the Geneva the authorized version, or set about the task of creating a better translation. The latter suggestion appealed to the king's vanity. And so on July 22nd in 1604, the king announced the appointment of 54 men to work under the guidance of Richard Bancroft, the Bishop of London. It took another 3 years before the work was started, and there were 47 translators named. They were then divided between the 3 academic centres of England, Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster, 2 committees meeting at each location. The books were divided, and each man made his own translation. He then passed it along to the other members of his group for approval. They then submitted their section to each of the other 5 committees. When it had been amended, it was sent to the select committee of the best 12 scholars, and they agreed on the final revision. This was the greatest translation to date. It was the work of the greatest minds of that generation. The knowledge of Greek and Hebrew had greatly increased. And finally, Shakespeare, Spencer, Marlowe, and others had elevated literary taste through a new literary style. This book, therefore, was considered to be the greatest masterpiece of English literature, unparalleled by preceding or even succeeding generations. It was destined to become the best-selling book of all time. In 1580, a young man by the name of William Brewster was attending Peterhouse College in Cambridge. Though Brewster was unable to determine the goals of his academic pursuit, he was exposed to and adopted the doctrine of the Puritans. He was to play a crucial role in the founding of a brand new colony and eventually a nation. Brewster befriended another young man by the name of William Bradford. In 1602, they started walking 12 miles to Gainsborough to worship at the Separatist church. The church had just called John Smythe, a Cambridge-educated man, as their pastor. This assembly considered themselves a separate and independent institution, accountable to none but its own congregation. For this stand they were persecuted by the state, and by 1606 Smythe the pastor and several of his congregation were obliged to flee into exile. They escaped to Amsterdam, where Smythe became a physician. During this time in history, Holland had a reputation for religious tolerance that attracted many persecuted religious groups. Brewster invited the members who remained to his manor in Scobie, England, and he became their spiritual advisor. Among those that joined this underground church was John Robinson. He was a minister from Norwich and had to flee from there for his own safety. This subjected Brewster's assembly to suspicion and persecution. Many members lost their property, paid heavy fines, and suffered stiff prison sentences. It soon became apparent that freedom of worship would necessitate their exile also.
I'm standing here by Fishtoft, about 4 or 5 miles from Boston, on marshy, soggy ground, where the Pilgrim Fathers met back in September of 1607. It wasn't a simple thing to migrate from England in those days. There was a law on the books known as Statute 13, Richard II, that made it illegal for a person to leave England without a permit. And what compounded the problem for these people was that on the 15th of that month, a warrant had been issued for the arrest of William Brewster, but the authorities were just not able to find him.
The group negotiated with the Dutch captain to meet them in the marshy waters at Fishtoft. After the Puritans had loaded their goods and their families, waiting for the tide to rise, they were surrounded by the sheriff's officials. The men were robbed, the women immodestly searched, and brought back to the city of Boston.
When they were brought into the city of Boston, the majority of them were detained in another area. But 7 of them that were considered ringleaders were brought here to the Guildhall, and they were kept in these 2 cells. There's a board or a bench that's against the wall at this side and at that side, and it's the same in the other cell. And the 7 men were kept in these quarters. A stairway beside me leads up into the courtroom where they were tried. I think they were very kindly treated, because John Cotton was the minister of the local church, and John Cotton's the name of the man that led a migration to the new land in 1630, only 10 years after the Pilgrim Fathers went. So the town people were sympathetic to the Pilgrims. They were kept here for 1 month. Then they were released to be taken to a tribunal in Lincoln, at which they were released on their own recognizance. But by the time that William Brewster arrived back at Scroby Manor, he had nothing left. He had lost everything in this venture.
We don't know how long they were imprisoned, but we do know that they made another attempt to migrate out of England. In 1608, they finally arrived in Amsterdam. Joining the group who had migrated before them, they now numbered about 100. All of them had left a farming life and were now forced to compete in a world of trade. They were plain folks, utterly honest, hard workers and conscientious to a fault. The readjustment in their lives had to be accomplished through a foreign language. This is the actual church where they used to worship while they were in Amsterdam. After about a year, they appealed to the city of Leiden, about 35 miles south, for permission to live in that city. Permission granted, they relocated in Leiden for the next 11 years and were exemplary in character. They grew to about 300. This is the same church where they used to worship while they were in Leiden. The pastor became an honorable member of the university. Their products were used by other tradesmen, and they were given credit when it was needed. In fact, traveling English tradesmen such as Edward Winslow and Miles Standish cast their lots with them. In the course of time, it became obvious that they had to move once more. There were many factors. It was difficult to make a living in this new market. The children were joining the Netherlands army, and some were submitting to the temptations of the city. Also, because they were a minority, conditions threatened to absorb them into the community, and they were much too patriotic to permit that to happen. Finally, persecution was beginning to reach them. 2 books that the Pilgrims had written had reached England, and James I wanted them brought to justice. All of these conditions related to the destiny of their next move, and several options were discarded in favor of a new home in the colonies. A group of 70 London merchants came up with a proposal which the Pilgrims finally accepted. They had claims to a tract of land obtained from the London Company with a right to self-government. A contingency from England were to join the Leiden group, and they were to cross the Atlantic in 2 vessels, a 60-ton pinnace called the Speedwell and a 180-ton known as the Mayflower. It was from this very canal that the Pilgrims boarded the Speedwell to begin their journey to the new land. They were to rendezvous with the English contingent at Southampton before facing the Atlantic. The journey to the New World began on August the 5th in 1620. There were 30 passengers on the Speedwell and 90 on the Mayflower. After battling contrary winds for 3 days, the Speedwell sprung a leak and had to pull into Dartmouth for repairs. Completely overhauled, they put out to sea the second time. By this time, the two vessels had gone 300 miles on the other side of Land's End, and the Speedwell sprung another serious leak. The both vessels had to turn back to the closest port they could find, which was Plymouth. And by that time, there were 18 passengers on the Speedwell who decided that they didn't want to migrate to the new land. That left 102 passengers, and they decided they would crowd onto the Mayflower and take their chances. Those Pilgrims were very familiar with the perils of trying to cross the Atlantic Ocean. There were 180 of them from the Amsterdam church that migrated to Virginia in March of 1619, but only 50 of them arrived at their destination. Overcrowding and disease took a heavy toll on life. The first part of the journey was uneventful, until gales with a terrific force battered their vessel. One storm followed another. One person died, but a baby was born. This enabled the same number to arrive as had left the port in England. It was after 9 weeks on the open seas that they finally sighted land. It was on November the 9th, and they became somewhat concerned when they found out that it wasn't under the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. That concern drove them to draw up that familiar and famous Mayflower Compact. There were 41 of the men that signed that contract. They believed that they did it here in this room, the main cabin of Master Christopher Jones. The Mayflower sat off the coast, while 2 separate expeditions set out to find a harbor. Outside of a brief encounter with Indians, they were greatly encouraged with the country, but they were unable to find fresh water or a suitable harbor. It was December the 6th when the 3rd expedition set out. They went out in a little boat similar to the one behind me, known as the Shallop, and they came to land. They found varied cornfields and little brooks, and then they returned to the Mayflower. But there was also good news awaiting them, because the Mayflower, that until that time was positioned out in Cape Cod Bay, was now able to come into the Plymouth harbor, and 27 days of expedition had finally brought the voyage to a close. You may find it curious, but the Bible that the Pilgrims brought to this new land was not the King James Version. Because of their strong Puritan beliefs, they preferred the Geneva edition. It was from the words of this Bible that they got their resolve and their strength. The greatest adversity that they were ever going to face lay directly ahead of them. The Bible was their only sure foundation in their great time of need. It was December 28th when they finally decided on an exact location for the settlement. They immediately started building barricades. A street was plotted parallel to a stream. The avenue leading from the rock had been named Leyden Street. Because of the severity of the winter, the delays caused by the Speedwell, and the fierceness of the storms they faced on the Atlantic when they were coming across the water, they came here totally unprepared for what lay ahead of them. The months of January and February were particularly heavy.
It said that by the end of February, 31 of them had died, mostly women. When they died, they waited until nightfall. Then they took their bodies here to Coves Hill, overlooking Plymouth Harbor. And they buried them, leveled off the graves, and planted on top of it, particularly concerned about what the Indians would think. Sickness was so severe among them that they had taken the first house they built and converted it into a hospital. And they still face problems because there were more people that were sick than were well able to tend to their needs. It's reported that by the end of January, 1/2 of the pilgrims died and were buried here at Coles Hill.
By the middle of March, the warm sun indicated their first severe winter was past. The Indians were greatly feared, and Miles Standish organized a militia and situated 5 cannons on Fort Hill platform. Then one morning, near the end of March, another startling event occurred.
They were about to hold a meeting in their common house when an Indian came walking down the middle of the road, and he greeted them with a hearty welcome in English. He was going to go into the house when they stopped him until they found out more about him. They found out that his name was Samson, and he yielded to them a wealth of information.
The following Thursday, he introduced them to Squanto. Squanto was fluent in English. He was one of 24 natives who had been kidnapped and sold as slaves in Spain. He had escaped to England and eventually returned to the area only to discover that he was the sole survivor of his tribe. Squanto, in turn, introduced the pilgrims to another native leader by the name of Massasoit, who brought 60 of his men with him. The result was that a peace pact was organized between them that lasted for the next 50 years. On April 5th, 1621, the Mayflower hoisted her sails and set out once more for the open seas. This was the last link that bound the pilgrims to England, and they watched its upper sails disappear into the horizon of water.
These brave and courageous pilgrims in the government of circumstance became the seeds of a new nation. It must be remembered they were humans made of flesh and blood like we are. They sacrificed fortunes, they suffered privations, they endured hardships, but for one supreme purpose. They wanted the freedom to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. And it must be remembered, they prized that liberty above life itself, and all the obstacles that were placed in their way to prevent the accomplishment, they overcame. While we pay tribute to these great men, the forefathers of this nation, we ought to pause for a moment and pay tribute to the source of their strength, the place where they found comfort in sorrow, to the magnet that drew them across 3,000 miles of churning, tempestuous, cold Atlantic waters beyond the edge of civilization. The source of that strength was a book, the Bible. They held it supreme in all matters of faith and practice. And that Bible we know as the Indestructible Book.